Hello and welcome back. My name is Shannon and I'm the owner and creator here at Knotted Threads Co. For the last few months, I've been working on my most recent PDF pattern called the Adena shoulder bag. I'm happy to announce that it's finally available for purchase on my website or on Etsy. The links for both are in the description below. So let's meet the Adena. She's a medium to large shoulder bag. She has an adjustable strap with a really unique feature, and it really leads into these nice angles that are featured all throughout the bag. So the Adena features these fun magnet bridges, as I call them, and they allow for a little bit of a more unique closure, but also they allow for you to fill up the bag a little bit more without fear of the magnets popping open. You also get this really fun dual pocket overlay that mimics some of the angles you see in the rest of the Adena, while featuring a 2-in-1 pocket design. So this is an all new pocket design, and you'll see that it has a zipper up top and a slip pocket below. That slip pocket is perfect for your cell phone. The Adena is a design that requires minimal hardware. You just need this one 1-inch pin buckle, a handful of rivets. If you want, you could add cute little purse feet, a magnetic snap, and a single zipper pull. So I'm what some people may call a tiny human. I'm 5'1". You can see though that the Adena is a really comfortable carry even on somebody tiny like me. But if you're worried that the strap length won't be one that fits your size, don't worry about that. I've got you covered. There's some tips in the pattern to lengthen or shorten the strap depending on your preferences. It's super easy and I give you tips to do it. I take all the guesswork out of it. So you're probably thinking, well, I love the design, but oh my gosh, it looks so difficult. I promise it's not. It's not a very complicated pattern. There's only 2 pockets inside, and it's a 2-in-1 ordeal. The exterior comes together in no time, and I take all the guesswork out of it for those really pointy side panels. Don't stress. I've done that for you. So the Adena is an intermediate pattern. So of course you're going to be dealing with curves, you're going to be dealing with angles, and a new pocket. But it's honestly not bad at all. I would tell you if I thought that this was complex. So let's say we wanted to rate the difficulty level of the Adena compared to some of my other patterns. It's definitely not as hard as the Rowena. It's easier than the Aries, I think. And it gives you that instant gratification that you get from the Rosie. Is it domestic friendly? Yes. A couple 3 patterns ago, I learned my lesson, and nowadays every pattern I released has gone through a very long, painstaking process to make sure that I've taken as many bulk reduction techniques as I can, and I've implemented them wherever I can throughout the pattern. The Adena is no different. You're never going to be sewing through more than maybe 6 layers of material at any given time, and if you do, it's only for a single stitch, but I don't even think you have that on the Adena. So included with your purchase, you get 71 pages of extensive, detailed instructions with high-quality photos, handy hyperlinks, and digital markings throughout. It's really like luxury in a pattern. You'll also get full paper pattern pieces, so no cutting on the fold here. Lots of helpful hints on those, also markings to help you place your purse feet and things like that, as well as projector files, cutting machine files, and an AO file. But all of that in addition to a project planning sheet. Now, one of the things about the Adena that's so nice is that it has so many color blocking opportunities. But with so many opportunities, sometimes it's hard to organize your brain and to make those choices and to visualize it all. So this is really helpful for that, and it's included for free with your purchase. So I think you've heard enough of my rambling. Let's get started. A quick note before we get started. I just wanted to give you a quick apology for those of you who get a little weirded out by hand wounds. We have a rescue, Oliver, and he's been with us since January, and he has superior hunting skills, which means that when we play, he is rather rough. I play with him a lot every day to get some of that energy out, and of course, I am the lucky recipient of lots of scratches and little puncture wounds on my hands, and so you will see them throughout this tutorial. I am sorry if that bothers you, but it is just part of life, and it is what it is. So before we get started in the construction, I wanted to walk you through the materials that I chose for this bag so you know where they come from, what type of material I'm using, and how I color blocked it. So for the main panel, I'm using an Essex linen canvas version. So normally when you get it, it's a little bit lighter weight. It's a linen cotton blend, I believe. And I got the canvas version of that. I hadn't seen that before, and I ordered it, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago, and I really love it. So I wanted to use that on the main panel, so here I am. For those main panels, I've already done the prep work for everything, so I already have it interfaced and stabilized. And so in the pattern, I call for 2 layers of woven interfacing, one at the full size of the pattern piece, one at the stabilizer size, and then you would top all of that with the Thermolam or fusible fleece on top of that. Now, because I'm using woven, I just added an additional layer of woven interfacing to the full pattern piece there. So it's 2 layers at full size, 1 at the stabilizer size, and then the additional layer of Thermolam. These are the side accents, and I'm using Saddle Smooth from Iris Textiles. This is the colorway Dawn. I just can't stop using this color. I think it pairs so well with everything. It's like a cloud gray color. I really love the tone. It's like I don't know, it's kind of like a beige, but it's very light. It comes off as white depending on what you're pairing it with. Because I'm pairing it with a tan, it's going to come off a little bit more beige. But I just cannot stop using it for the Adena. I absolutely love it, and I really adore Saddle Smooth itself. So I also used it on the base, as you can see. But for the side accents, I have fused that Decaville Light. As you can see, there's not as much of a gap between the Decaville Light and the edge of the material, and that is by design. So don't stress if you fuse that and you wonder why it's a bigger piece. It's because we're going to intentionally sew it into the seam. And on the base, you can see I've installed purse feet. They are extremely adorable. They are from Alchemats. I will link that in the video description, but they are clunky and chunky and cute, and I love it. And so I've installed that. As you can see, I have 2 layers of stabilizer here. When I want a really nice firm base of a bag, I like to do 1 layer of Decaville Heavy and 1 layer of Decaville Light. As you can see, this layer of Decaville Light is a little smaller than the layer of Decaville Heavy. Again, that is by design. If you have printed out the pattern pieces, you'll see on the base stabilizer piece, I do tell you that if you would like to have a firmer base, I give you the instructions for that, and there's a dashed line in there that has you cut to that size. The outer strap panels are Mora faux leather. I believe this is colorway tan. You can get that at Emmeline Bags. There are other places that sell Mora now. I like Mora for the side panels. Mora really pairs well with foam. If you fuse it properly, it just has a really great lightweight yet luxurious feel to it, so I definitely recommend it. It also makes for a pretty comfortable strap, so that's why I chose that. And lastly, the strapper keeper here, we will construct that later, but that is also made with the Dawn Saddle Smooth. I realized I forgot to mention the stabilizer that we use on the outer strap panels. I use foam for those. And it's not fused all the way to the end of the strap panels because this is kind of your strap portion and this is your body portion. So this is where we really need more of that stabilization. I don't recommend changing out this stabilizer for something like fusible fleece or Thermolam or Decaville Light or Decaville Heavy. I've just found that having this padding here between or having this foam here between the exterior and the lining and the way that the lining is sewn and stuff, this just gives you a more smoother finish from the outside. You don't see any of your interior or lining seams when you have foam here, because at this point in your bag, when you've sewn your whole bag, and around right here on your inner strap panel, there is a seam that meets up with a center seam down the lining. And so all of those things meet up right there, and if you have too light of a stabilizer on the outer strap panel, then that can kind of push out over time, and this foam just truly helps everything sit really nicely and how we want it. Not to mention it provides more structure for the bag. So I definitely don't recommend swapping this. If you do, your results may vary. You can see I've also installed Decaville Light or Profuse Stiff along the strap. And the pattern, you can use waterproof canvas. I also tell you can substitute it with Decaville Light if you prefer. Just for your sake, I typically use waterproof canvas, but for this tutorial I decided to opt for the Profuse Stiff on the longer strap portion just so that you can kind of see it there, and also because this is a lighter weight material. The waterproof canvas helps serve the purpose of stabilizing your strap as well as helping to prevent some twisting or stretching over time, especially when we are going to be punching holes along this strap. So it's pretty important to keep it stabilized in some capacity. You only need to do it on the exterior. I did it on the lining or the inner strap panel initially, and then we ended up getting rid of that because truly you had the structure and the stabilization that you needed, and it was contributing to wrinkles on the inner part of your strap. So it's just something to keep in mind. It keeps it a lot less bulky as well when you are installing it through the pin buckle. So again, I don't recommend skipping the stabilizer options or changing them up here on the outer strap panels because they are pretty important. And you can see I've also installed a little bit of Decaville Light there. I do tell you all about that in the pattern, but that will be for our strapper keeper. For the lining side of things, I am using a Ruby Star Society print for my lower lining. It is canvas, but I have still backed it with woven interfacing. I always use woven interfacing for all of my woven pieces, as should you when you're making bags. And for my dual pocket overlay here, I am using the Dawn Saddle Smooth again. I have done the extra prep work there and further prep. So I've punched my holes, I have my stabilizer on there, and I have cut my slip pocket slot. For the magnet bridges, they are also Dawn Saddle Smooth, and they have been prepped and fused with a rectangle there of Profuse Stiff. The upper lining is the tan Mora faux leather, and I have used Thermolam here. You could also use fusible fleece. Thermolam is just a little bit stiffer, so it provides just a little bit more structure. And then the inner strap panels here, we have one that's cut short and one that's longer, just like on the outer strap panels. There's no long interfacing that is put on the inner strap panel, but there is the inner strap panel stabilizer that is fused on both kind of shorter portions or the bag portions of the inner strap panels. Last but not least is the pocket linings. I've chosen to use Renew Canvas for those. You can find that at Mormino. It is a little bit transparent here if you're going to go for something clear like this, but once it's folded back on itself and it's in the pocket of your bag, you can't really see anything through it, and so I do like it. I also like that it creases really well, which is not always the case with all waterproof canvas. Doesn't really hold a press too well typically, but this one does, and so I do like that. And it's why I don't mind using it for the lining of the bag. So it's kind of why I typically stick with woven linings, because it's just, it conforms to the interior of the bag much better, in my opinion, than waterproof canvas. One more thing before we get started is this dual pocket overlay here. If you wanted to edge paint it, doing it sooner rather than later is in your best interest, because we don't want any of this to still be wet and have your edge painting be damaged when you go to sew it. I recommend edge painting these outer edges here and only the bottom edge of this slip pocket if you choose to do that. If you edge paint both the bottom and the top, since it was just cut with a rotary blade and it has no gap between these pieces, those edge painting layers will stick to one another when you apply heat, or over time the pressure will have them stick together, and that could ruin the finish. I try to use materials that have a backing that matches the color of the vinyl so that I don't really have to go through any of that. But if you have something like a light backing with a dark finish, then you may need to do that. I would suggest though maybe using a lining color for your slip pocket that matches the backing color, and that may help kind of mask it, and then you don't have to worry about edge painting it. But as long as you just edge paint this bottom, you should be fine. Just make sure it's not overly thick or you're going to run into the same issues as if you would have edge painted both edges there. And last but not least is the hardware. You know I've already installed the purse feet on my base, but other than that you would need rivets. I tend to use 8mm caps. They're kind of like medium size and I just prefer them. And then the post length will vary depending on what I'm using, but typically about a 9mm post length is going to get the job done for the Adena. You will need your number 5 nylon zipper tape and a number 5 nylon zipper pull here. This one is also from Alchemats, and it is a cute little paw print that matches the purse feet. And then you will also need a pin buckle here. Now I go into detail about this in the pattern pretty early on about your pin buckle. You want to make sure that you have one that is substantial. You don't want to use any thin pin buckles for this. It's going to be supporting the weight of your bag in partially, not fully, but definitely it will need to be substantial enough to get that job done. So if you're using something that's pretty flimsy, I'll show you that in a moment, then that's kind of, you're not going for that, okay? There isn't that much hardware in this bag, so I just recommend investing in a good one. All of mine have come from Mormino that look like this. Otherwise, I have gotten one from Emmeline Bags, and that one works as well, and they offer matte black, which was nice too. The other part of the pin buckle that is important, not so much that it's just substantial, but also that you have this recessed bar here that is kind of part of the mold of the pin buckle, okay? You don't want it to be completely separate. You don't want weak points on there. What you want is for it to be a fully substantial, like cohesive sort of mold here, and these are just really good and they get the job done, and I've been very happy with them for the materials that I typically use. So this is an example of a pin buckle I would not recommend. So yes, it looks substantial here, but it's not. It's just has the image of being that. You can see that the central bar has just been welded partially to the bottom, not fully, and so it is more prone to breaking there. It is recessed, but just not a lot, and that's just by the fact that this is just not a thicker piece of hardware. And lastly, this pin buckle moves around a lot. And so when it's kind of stuck in the center of your pin buckle, it kind of forces things to be where they're supposed to be, and it doesn't put any unnecessary stress on this pin itself, because the pin is never really what's going to be supporting your material. It's going to be this central bar and these outer bars that are going to disperse the kind of force and the stress of the load. So this is just kind of locking it into that one spot on your strap versus kind of holding all of the pressure there. And it's when it does get held, it just pushes it against the bar, which again, of course, transfers some of that pressure onto the bar. So it's just good for that to be stabilized there. So this was from Amazon. If you are going to be purchasing pin buckles from Amazon, just really pay attention to, one, the inner width to make sure it'll fit properly, and really take a good look at the construction and make sure that it is going to be able to support your bag. And you'll also need an 18mm magnetic snap, because that is the closure option for this bag. I'm using pronged. That's typically what I use just because I don't like swapping out my rivet press all too much. But you can also use rivet magnets, and I even give you instructions for that in the pattern if that is your choice to do so. If you wanted to opt out of the strapper keeper and you wanted to use a strap bridge instead, you are welcome to do so. There's some notes in the cut list that kind of tell you what things to skip if you aren't doing the strapper keeper. These are a little bit more sleek looking, but I just enjoy making the strapper keeper, and I like that it adds just a little bit of color blocking to that panel. I just like that it kind of extends my color blocking to the outer strap panel, I should say. So that's definitely an option for you, but there are some things to keep in mind here. One is that if it's too narrow, it could potentially not fit too well in your with your strap. Remember that if you're doing something like this where there's no backing on it, you are installing it onto a piece that has foam. And so as you use your screws and your plate and you kind of compress those materials right here on either sides of where their screws are, that foam is then going to kind of go into this gap here. So then you're going to lose that depth for the strap to pass through. And so something like this could potentially be too narrow for your strap panel. I have not had success using one of these without it being very tight on my strap panel. So that's pretty frustrating. But if you have thinner material, or if your foam isn't as dense as mine, I use Pellon flex foam, and so it's a 1/4 inch thick, and so it tends to be a little bit more lofty, but just something to keep in mind for this. If you go this route, this one's from Wawak, it has this bar here, so the compression is happening throughout the entire strap bridge, so that foam never penetrates into the opening. So that tends to be helpful, but also this is actually fully 1 inch inside this strap bridge. This one I have is not, and it's also why it contributes to the straps not working. So definitely take a look at the website, the listing, the shops, the reviews, anything like that. Make sure that you have enough depth here and enough width here. It's pretty important with these. So jumping right into construction, we're going to start with the side panel assembly. So for that, we have the side accents here. Remember, there are 2 mirrored sets. We have the outer strap panels. One is shorter and one is longer. You should have all of your interfacings and stabilizers fused and all the work done called for in the further prep work section done. In addition to these, if you're using a strap bridge, you will need that. And if not, if you're using a strapper keeper, you will need the strapper keeper, the backing for it, and then a rivet. And you'll also need your 2-point stabilizers using Profuse Stiff or Decavallite. So the first step in the process is to draw the 3/8 inch seam allowances, at least on the bottom portion of your strap panels. This is going to help you know where to start and stop your stitching so that your sewing comes to a perfect point within that seam allowance. It's just a little hard to eyeball that, and I have just found that that's the best way to do it, and I don't recommend doing it without it, to be honest. So definitely just take that minute and draw it. You will come to find out just how uneven you fuse your outer strap panel stabilizer or your OSP stabilizer. Like me, it's okay. As my husband likes to say, it'll buff out. So once you've drawn those seam allowances, we're going to need to create 2 groups just so that we don't get confused here. And so each one should have a mirrored set of side accents. It doesn't matter which one you start with. For this process, I will be starting with the shorter side just so it's easier to maneuver on camera. So when you're sewing your side accents onto your outer strap panel, you want to make sure that you are sewing this long angled edge here with this short straight bottom, not this long straight angled edge here, okay? These are the ones that are going to follow with the outer strap panel. And so I tell you to take your right side accent and place it on the right side of your outer strap panel and then clip along the length. And the reason why I tell you that is because you're going to end up sewing with your outer strap panel facing up so you can see that seam allowance marking that we did. And then what you will do is start in the points of your work versus the top of your work. And that way you can follow the seam allowance marking on your machine. So you would insert your needle at this point and then sew up to the top of your work technically. And you would be able to start here. And it's a little easier to start in the points when you don't have the other side sewn on. I used to tend to do it the other way around, but truly this is the way to do it, and this is the way that over the last like 4 or 5 bags I keep telling myself to do, and I kick myself when I don't, so I just decided to write it into the pattern. So that's what we're going to do. So now that we have clipped our work, we're going to take it to the machine. I'm going to insert my needle into the tip of the point that I drew, and then I'm just going to sew along this edge, making sure I backstitch. Nothing too crazy there, and then I'll check back in. So I've got that edge sewn here, and so if I were to open it up, again, that is my right side. And so now when I clip the other side together, again, I'm going to choose the one that has this short side on the bottom. I'm going to clip it along this length. And then as I get closer to this bottom edge, I like to use my stapler just because I think it gives a better hold to my positioning here. And that's really what is important to me for this. So I tend to do them fairly close to my stitch line, but I also know I won't sew on them. So maybe about a 1/4 inch in, like that. And so what I will do is I will then put this on my machine, and then now again I'm sewing with this outer strap panel this side up so that I can see my drawing, so I know where I need to stop sewing. And I'm just going to sew using a 3/8 inch seam allowance down this edge here, and then back stitch down at this point just like I did on the other one, but I'm going to make sure that I don't cross it. One thing I didn't mention before was that I do like to use a shorter stitch length on these seams just because it tends to give it just a slightly tighter hold, and you know, we have this point here where it's not going to be receiving a lot of stress in the bag, but it does have a little bit of stress sewing when you top stitch it, right? Because things are going to be folded in specific ways and stuff like that. So I just tend to use just a slightly smaller stitch length. I typically use a 4 for construction, and I drop it down to a 3.5. It also gives me more control over how far I'm sewing when I get to that point, right? So if my stitch length is shorter, that means it takes more of them to get to this point. So when I'm not too sure, I can always just kind of inch it just a little bit shorter of a distance until I get where I want to. So I will do that, and then we'll move on. So I've sewn up those 2 edges. I did not pass the drawn point that I have, and I have removed my staples. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to match up this right angle here, this corner of the side accents. Let me get you darker so you can see better. And then you can clip or you can staple. I do like to staple. Again, there's a lot going on right here, and I just find it a little easier to keep everything where I want it to be. There is some wiggle room, but of course we can always try our best too. And so I also move this little excess here, this point of the extra seam allowance for that point. I push that in so that when I sew, and I sew along this edge right here, I don't have to worry about catching that in that seam and have it sticking out on the outside. So we're going to sew along this short edge right here. It's not long, maybe about 1 inch, and you want to backstitch well, but again, don't cross your stitch line here. And so you'll do that, and as long as you followed your seam allowance marking and you clipped everything correctly, then everything should line up really well, and it's not bulky at all. So I'll do that, and then we'll see what everything looks like. So as you can see, I've sewn this seam right here, and I met up with my point, and it met up well on both sides. So I'm going to take my staples out. So now we are almost ready for top stitching, but we need to remove some bulk first. If you were to feel this bottom of your work, you'll see that all that seam allowance is pointing up and pretty tall, and you can't really see, or you can't really have it lay flush unless you were to open up the seam allowance. And that's not what we're going to do here. We want the seam allowance to point in like it is doing right now. And the reason why it's pointing in is because we have that Decovite sewn into the seam here. That's by design. It is for structure as well as stability and durability for this point down here. But we need to remove the excess seam allowance. And so you could see that it's kind of forming a line down here that kind of points to this center seam. And what we want to do is just kind of remove all the bulk that's past that line while always maintaining at least 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So it's kind of tricky, and it is a little bit you just kind of do it to learn it ordeal. But essentially you just trim a little bit at a time. I'm trimming through both the side accent seam allowance and the point, or the strap panel seam allowance. So I tend to get to this point, and then I will trim the side accent seam allowance down like that. And then I'll do the same on the other side. Then I'll start trimming away this point just a little bit, using the side accent as my guide, and just little snips here and there until I get my desired results. But again, I want to maintain at least 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, okay? So I'm going to do it a little bit more trimming on this side. And so the goal is so that now when you were to lay it flat, the only part that's going to be poking up is going to be the very tip of your point. And that's okay. We're going to open up this bottom later anyway, which is going to allow this excess to lay flat. And we actually aren't going to be top stitching down in the bottom of this point as well, because that's technically not where our 1/8 inch seam allowance is going to be. All that extra seam allowance and bulk is down at this very tip of this point, and when we top stitch, we're going to stop about maybe 1/4 inch up from that intersection of those seams. So just the goal again is to leave 1/8 of an inch minimum and to get it as flush and as flat as you can. So I'm fairly happy with that. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my point stabilizer here, and I'm going to just trim it down so that it kind of turns out to be a bit of a cone shape, very similar to the bottom of this seam, just like that. And I'm going to fuse it on my seam like this. Now, when I do this, I'm going to make sure that this bottom seam stays open and everything stays forward. And I want to make sure that I'm not pushing this together like this when I'm fusing it, because if I do that, it's not going to fuse properly. So just make sure that everything is kind of where you feel like it should be. If you feel like anything is poking up or kind of fighting you, then that means that maybe something isn't pointing the right direction. So I'll fuse this and I'll show you what I mean. So I have pressed this on here. The seam allowances are for the outer strap panel are pointing in, and the bottom of the side accent seam allowances are pointing out. And that's what we want. That way we have a nice seam that's flat when we sew on our base, and we have everything where it needs to be for a nice secure seam on the outer strap panel for top stitching. So I made sure that I fused it no lower than my side accent stabilizers, and again, everything is where it needs to be. Additionally, you could also hammer this slightly. Just be careful that you don't damage your material in the process. So I always love when I forget to hit the record button. But now that you have added this point stabilizer to the bottom, you can do some trimming up top, and this is some bulk reduction. What it does is it just removes about a stitch of bulk and makes it a little bit smoother of a top stitch for your drop-in lining. And so what you're going to do is you're going to snip into your side accent seam allowance only. So you have two parts here, your outer strap panel and your side accent panel. And you're going to angle your scissors to match the angle of the top of your seam, of your seam allowance here. Not this edge, but the seam allowance edge. So you'll snip like that. You can see my angled edge right there. Hopefully, let's focus. And I snipped into the side accent seam allowance only, and close to my stitches, but not, I did not snip my stitches. And that's important because obviously you want your seam to stay intact, but it also allows you to fully open this seam up here. So we don't have to snip the outer strap panel because that's going to stay put. It's going to get top stitched in place, and that we're fine with that. But we want to make sure we open up this side accent so that when we fold it down later, we get a smoother seam for our drop-in. So once you get done doing that, you'll just clip it right open there, and you'll repeat that on the other side. So now that we have those seam allowances opened, we can just top stitch away. We're going to top stitch down and up. And so what I like to do is I like to start on my outer strap panel, top stitch along this curve until I hit my side accent panel so that I'm tacking down that open seam allowance, back stitch, and then sew down to this point, and then back up and again tack down that seam allowance and then finish my seam. Now I find it best to use between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch seam allowance up here, just so that when you're doing your snipping for the drop-in, you can mostly avoid it when you keep it there. But it's not the end of the world if it's 1/8 of an inch, truly. Keep in mind while you're top stitching too is that it's going to be a little hard to figure out exactly where the center of this point is and what the 1/8 inch seam allowance is. So if you want to, you can always use a removable marking pen, and you can draw that seam allowance down here and just don't pass the intersection of your drawn seam allowance and you'll be good to go. But again, it's a little deceiving where that point is going to be. As you can see, it's a little higher than you might expect it to be. It's about 1/4 of an inch from this bottom point here. But visually it works out. It's very balanced when you sew it up, and that's where your pivot point is. So just keep that in mind. So as you can see, I've got my top stitching done. I went down, back up, and then I tacked it right there. And on the back, you can see everything is nice and where it should be. When you're done with that, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I want you to baste that bottom seam allowance open just to make sure, again, that everything stays where we need it to be. And as you can see, I was able to get those basted up there. So now that your first side panel is done, we're going to move on and construct the other one, doing the exact same process that we did all throughout here, but now we're going to do it on the other group that we had. So I'll do that, and then we'll move on to installing the strapper keeper. So now I finished the second strap panel. As you can see, I have it top stitched and my seam allowance is open and tacked down, and I have made sure that I have my point stabilizer on, and I have basted open these bottom seam allowances. So now it's time to install the strapper keeper, and so the important part of this is to make sure that you're doing it on the shorter of the two strap panels. If you install it on the longer one, you will have nowhere to put your strap on your shorter strap panel. Remember, it's going to wrap over the bag and get installed in the opposing panel. So make sure it's not on the long one. I repeat, not on the long one. So we have our shorter one here. And of course you will also need the strapper keeper, the backing for it, and not the magnet, a rivet. So you have your little strapper keeper here, and what you're going to do is on the wrong side you are going to draw a center line, and then along that center line or right on top of it you're going to apply some double-sided tape. Now you can use 1/4 inch, you could use 2 1/8 inch pieces, but I don't recommend going any higher than that. So as you can see, I just removed that double-sided tape backing, and now I'm going to fold in this edge here to meet that center line, and I'm going to do that for both sides, and I'm not going to leave a gap. Now if you use 1/4 inch double-sided tape, there's a good chance you're going to sew over that double-sided tape, so keep some machine oil and or some alcohol wipes to clean your needle off, because we're going to top stitch around this entire piece using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now I like to sew this in a box just so that everything stays nice and secure. You could do 2 strips if you'd like. So I've got this top stitch now. You can see everything met up nicely. And so once you get that done, we're going to need to make some markings on the strap panel. Now, the way that I explain you to do it in the pattern is a little I don't want to say convoluted, but maybe a little bit more complicated than you think it needs to be, but it's for a reason. So the goal is to have a gap of 3/4 of an inch between our two markings, and we want to make sure that it stays on the stabilizer. So the best way to do that is to keep everything centered, but we don't have a really nice piece here to use our ruler with to make sure everything stays wonderfully centered. It's very easy to go off center if you're using just one side of your piece to place your ruler on, and with it being not a very wide one. So what I have you do instead is I have you mark this top center of this piece. This is 2 inches wide, so it's really simple to find that center. And then you also use your center seam down here as your reference point for the center of your bottom. And so what you would do at that point is you would mark, or you would place your ruler at that mark, and then along this bottom right here, just like this, and then you would make your little mark at 6.5 inches down. Then what I want you to do to make sure everything stays nice and centered is move that ruler 3/8 inch to the right. And then once you are sure that that's where it is, you'd make your marking there. Mine is actually a little off, so I guess I was a little off when I did it, so let me redo that. And the important part here is to make sure that you are drawing it down from this little 6.5 inch marking. That's going to keep it on that stabilizer that you put under the foam. So you want to make sure that it stays there. Then you're going to repeat that process, and you're going to do it on the other side. So you would place the marking up here at the 3/8 inch mark on your ruler, and then make sure that 3/8 inch marking on your ruler is also meeting up with that seam down there, and then you would draw right alongside the ruler. So now that I've fixed my line, now I need to cut into these slots that I've drawn through the exterior material, through the stabilizer, and through this foam as well. And so I have it's like a surgical blade here, and so that's what I'm going to use. Foam is also a little finicky, so I like to kind of just cut into the foam a little bit above and below that slot, and that kind of helps expand it. So as you can see, this stabilizer down here is on our cut slots, and that's what we want. So now I'm gonna clean off my markings. Many of you have heard this before, but I don't use heat to remove my heat erasable pen markings. I only ever use water. And you can wait and do this later. I'm just doing it now because it's bugging me. So now I'm going to take my strapper keeper and I'm going to insert it into this slot. Now this is not always the easiest thing to do because you can only compress this little strapper keeper so much. And so what I tend to do, first of all, is double check that my slot was fully cut. But then sometimes I'll grab pliers and I'll just reach through and kind of get a hold of it and then yank it through on the other side. I don't always need to do that, but sometimes it's helpful, depending on the material I'm using. I'm going to do that for this one. So again, I'll just reach through, and then I like to pinch this in half, grab this, and then just pull it through. Well, ideally, I'd pull it through. Of course not, because I'm on camera. There we go. Like that. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side. See, that's that foam right there not being fully cut, and that's why it's making it harder for me to pull through. There we go. So before moving on, it is good to double check that that seam, that center seam on the back side of the strapper keeper is facing towards the strap panel and not out where everyone can see it. And then I want you to just kind of make sure that these cut slots are kind of pointing in and not out. So this would be out. See how, it's kind of this one on top of that. You really want to push it so that the strapper keeper is on top of the outer strap panel there, like that. So you have no bulging there. And on the wrong side, we're going to sew this together using a hand sewing needle, and you only need to do a few inches, but we just want to close that loop. So I am no hand sewing expert here. I'm probably not even using the thimble correctly. So I'll bear with me, but essentially I just do what has worked for me and what I feel confident in, and then I go from there. So what I'll do is I'll insert my needle, my hand sewing needle, into the needles that I used on my machine when I sewed that seam. And that's kind of my guide of where I want to place my hand sewing stitches. So if you can see here, it's a little jumbled, I understand that. Part of it is because I have the old top stitching there as well as the hand stitching I just did. But essentially, I just kind of went in and from the bottom and then went across to my opposing needle hole over here from my top stitching, and then I went up at an angle through the center, did the same thing, back down through that other opposing needle hole, and then went up to this one, and then I did the same thing down. And so essentially that gave me 2 rows of stitching, it locked them in, and then I also went all the way to the edge and tacked down right here, tacked down right there, and then knotted it off. Is this the perfect stitching? I don't know. Does it work? Is this what I do? Yes. So that's why I do it. But I'm sure that you probably have a better solution or a better stitch, or you will take the time to do the research. I just did what I knew would work, and I'm using bonded thread, so even that's extra strong. So I find this to work. I've had no issues. I've tested it multiple times, even with lesser materials and with out that stabilizer down there. So it's good to go as long as you are sewing it with thread in a way that is secure. So for this next part, it's pretty simple. You need to use a type of glue that you know is going to be nice and strong and hold up over time. So you can use contact cement, you can use any kind of strong permanent glue, but it needs to be a strong permanent hold for sure. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to pull this back out so that it's flush with the back of this, and then you're going to rotate that seam to be just inside of one of those slots so that it's kind of to the side and out of the way of the rivet that we're going to install once this glue dries. So again, make sure that that slot is not bulging out behind your strapper keeper. It is nice and tucked behind it like that. So once we have that where it needs to be, I'm going to take my glue here and I'm going to put some behind it. I'm not really worried about this being messy because it's not really going to seep out the sides. I suppose it could, but it's more than likely not going to. So then I'm going to take my backing piece once I find it. So now that I've found that, took way too long, I'm going to generously apply some glue kind of all around it. I don't want to apply so much that I'm going to have it seep through that slot, but I also want to make sure that it fully encompasses this. Now, I do make a note that you could use Decovil Light if you wanted to, or a stabilizer in place of this glue, but essentially we're making our own stabilizer here. And I think that this is a stronger hold than just using stabilizer. Because that's essentially what stabilizer is it's just material with a layer of glue on it. And I'm telling you that I want you to make a stronger, more longer lasting stabilizer. So, and I didn't even cut this to the piece that the size that I call for in the pattern. It just needs to be a scrap essentially, something that will hold nicely. And so now I just need to let that sit and dry for a bit. And so what I do is I will use my metal block. This is pretty hefty, and so it does a good job for this right here. And so sometimes I'll put it on here like this, sometimes I'll just use a ruler, sometimes I'll use a piece of material, it doesn't really matter, but I just lay it on there nice and flat. And then I'll put something else heavy on top of that, such as my big old leather working hammer. and I let that dry and sit for a while. It might be like 30 minutes depending on the glue that you're using, but essentially you just want to let that glue set for a little while, and then it'll be good to go. So this has been drying for about 15-20 minutes. It's not fully dry or anything, but it is set enough to where I don't have to worry about it slipping off. But what I need to do now is I need to make a mark right there in the center. As you can see, I've already done that. And essentially we just want it to be right in the middle of the cut slots, both height and width-wise. And so once you do that, then you're going to pull this out of the way and punch a hole right there on that mark, and then insert and set your rivet. So I'll do that. So I've got that rivet installed there. Again, it's not super important that it's extremely centered and straight in there. The important part is that it's just in there, it's holding everything where we need it to be. You know, we don't want to puncture any stitches though, so the more centered you can get it, the better. And of course, that was also the reason for moving the hand sewing stitches to one side, to make sure we didn't puncture them when we punched our hole. You can see my rivet went through all layers. So now, again, I'm going to let this sit for a little while the glue continues to set, and then we'll move on to the exterior assembly. Moving right along to the exterior assembly, you will need 2 main panels, your base, and your 2 side panels. Now, I call these side panels just for the exterior assembly because I don't want essentially any confusion with the various pieces that we used in here, so no worries there. It's just the side panels for now. And then if you wanted to, you could add in a logo label or a decorative touch or element to the main panel. That's completely up to you. And I'm just showing you that my strapper keeper is nicely adhered. Everything is perfectly glued and in place and secure, and we have no worries for that. So as long as you use strong glue and you had a good adhesion and you let it sit for a while, you are good to go. As I was going to install my handmade plate, I noticed that I forgot to mark my centers. So if you haven't done that, now is a great time to do that. But what you also need to do is decide which of your main panels is going to be on the front of your bag. Now, normally you can kind of just wing this at some point, figure it out as you go, but because we have the longer strap panel, or the longer side panel, as I'm supposed to be calling it, you need to make sure that things are oriented correctly so that those 2 longer panels match up in the end, and then it also means that your front is in the front when you do that, and your pocket is on the back of the interior of your bag. So everything else it works out for you. You can kind of pick and choose where you need it to go. But for this, the exterior assembly, it does make sense to kind of do everything in a very specific order, as well as the lining assembly, so that you make sure everything lines up in the end. I have my front main panel here, and now I need to grab my longer side panel. And so now that I have that, I'm going to place it right sides together, and I'm going to clip along this angled side right here. As you can see, lines up quite nicely. So once you have this clipped, you're just going to sew along this edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So now that I've sewn that seam, again, we're going to do some trimming just like we did on this top of that outer strap panel. You're going to do the same thing over here on the main panel seam now. So essentially we're not going to be top stitching this side accent at all in this pattern. We're only going to be top stitching the main panels and the outer strap panel. So we already have the outer strap panels top stitched, so the rest of this process will be piecing together these side panels with the main panels and then top stitching the main panels. So I'm going to do, again, I'm going to angle my scissors into this side accent seam like this. I'm going to snip into my stitches, or I'm not going to stitch and snip into my stitch. I'm going to snip into my side accent seam allowance only here at an angle following this top curve or close to it. I didn't do a great job there. And then I'm going to snip into the main panel seam allowance, and then I'm going to trim them down. Now, because I'm using woven for this main panel, this bulk reduction isn't super necessary because normally you'd have a much thicker material as your main panel, and so it's really important. But I'm still going to do it because to me it is important to try and keep everything as smooth as it can be, but I'm not going to have an issue with bulk here on this side at all, even if I were to fold everything towards the side accent. So now down at the bottom of your seam, I like to flip it over and use my main panel stabilizer as my guide for where to snip into the seam here. Again, I'm going to do it on my side accent though, because I want that to be opened. And then I'm going to snip a little bit into the main panel, and I'm going to trim them both down to about 1/4 inch, like that. Then I'm going to clip both of them open. And now you can press this or roll this depending on the material that you are using. I'm going to do a little bit of both. That way I can make sure this is fully pressed out with this roller, but then give it a nice press with the iron, and that just gives me a nice smooth seam. And then we will top stitch. So now for top stitching, you're going to top stitch again on the main panel, and you're going to kind of mimic what you did up here at the top of this outer strap panel seam. You're going to tack down that open seam allowance, top stitch using an 1/8 inch seam allowance along the main panel, and again tack it down here on the bottom of your seam. Again, keep them close to like somewhere between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch, and just tack it parallel to the edge. So as you can see, I have top stitched kind of along this edge, kind of parallel to it. And then I went down and I top stitched and then stitched parallel down to this edge. So now you will simply repeat that process for the remaining side panel and main panel. So you're going to place this right sides down, clip it, sew it with that 3/8 inch seam allowance, open it up, do your snipping like we had done before, and then top stitch just as you did before. Then when you get done doing that, we're going to add the back main panel onto this last remaining seam here. It really can be on this shorter outer strap panel or this longer one. It's completely up to you. There's no rule as to which one you have to do first, but you just want to make sure that you attach your main panel. So you have all 4 pieces here kind of constructed in a line, and then we're going to do some marking and then essentially close up that loop of the bag. Don't forget your caffeine break. So as you can see, we have the shorter outer strap panel on the left of our front main panel and the longer strap panel on the right of our main panel. And then again, it doesn't matter which side you put the main panel on, but you just need to make sure it's attached and kind of at this state before we move on. So once we're at that state, we want to flip our work over, and we want to make these dashes along the top edge of your work. Now, some people might think you can just use your pattern piece and you can trace this line along your pattern piece, but that's not how this is going to work. As you can see how round these top edges are, it truly makes a difference if you use your pattern piece or you do it the way I instruct you to. You need to increase the curve here, and so as you can see, this is a bigger curve, and that's what we're going for. And it's really simple. It's a little tedious. It doesn't take that long. It's just not something that we normally do in bag making, so it's going to be slightly annoying at first, but you'll get used to it. But you should be doing this whenever you have a really round top curve like this. A more gentle curve, maybe this isn't as necessary, and you can use your pattern piece and kind of fudge it and it'll be fine. But this is truly the most effective way to make a contoured curve without having new pattern pieces to trace. So essentially all you're going to do is place your ruler along, you're going to place the 3/4 inch mark of your ruler along the top edge of your work, and then you're going to make a little dash at that mark all along this top edge. And so you just keep doing that. Once you get to close to the stabilizer, you don't need to continue that up because we're going to change that as well. But once you do that all along this top edge, you just connect those dots and create a line. When you get to this point up here at the top of your stabilizer on your outer strap panel, yours is probably not going to be overlapped like mine unless you cut yours a little bit longer like I did. But you need to essentially find the middle of this section like this, and you can just kind of eyeball connecting it, like kind of contouring it and grading it to match your dashes, but also meet in the middle. And that's going to essentially pull that in so that we can continue the strap, and the strap will end up being 1 inch wide. Because if we did it and we continued up this 3/4 inch mark all the way up, we would have then a harsh meeting later on, or we would have to do this eventually. So just do this now. It doesn't have to be the most exact perfect curve on each side. Again, as my husband likes to say, it'll buff out. Like it all works out when we get to this point. We just need to have a guide to follow that is drawn for us so we can see it, and then we'll feel what it wants to do. Not to mention we're going to make snips, so it's going to ease really nicely. So again, we're just going to trace this line. And I also don't recommend using removable ink because we're going to be pressing the bag, so we don't want to lose this line that we're drawing, especially because from this point on, it's a lot harder to get that really accurate contoured line. So now we'll flip this back over and we'll put these right sides together. It's going to take a little bit of convincing because it wants to go opposite of the way that we need it to go, but that's okay. We are strong and we can do it. So we're going to match up this edge here just like we did before. Clip. Do the same at the bottom. Clip along that edge, and then we will sew it again using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then we will be top stitching this just like we did the other ones, but it requires a little bit more coaxing again because we're sewing into a tube or a cylinder at that point. I will tell you kind of how I do it and how I make my top stitching look seamless even though it's actually broken up into 2 sections. So I'm going to do what I have done before, which is snip into my seam. Now we have that 3/4 inch line drawn. It's a lot easier to know where to make that snip. I always just eyeball mine except for the pattern. I always measure that just so that you have a permanent correct visualization, but you can eyeball it. It's way more forgiving than maybe I make it out to be. So I'm clipping these 2 seams open, and then I'm going to use my roller again and flatten this seam the best that I can, and I'm going to give it a press the best that I can. And then I'll show you at the machine how I top stitch it. So we are at my machine, and I'm going to do my best to show you how I top stitch this. Most of it's going to be blocked just because I can't really show you things from this angle that are mostly blocked for me as well. But so you want to do your normal top stitching that tacks down that opened seam allowance, and then you're going to follow your normal 1/8 inch seam allowance as far as you can. You will need to kind of fold back your work as you go, but it shouldn't be impossible. And I'm just keeping everything nice and flush with the table. Sometimes I can go all the way to the end, just really depends on the material I'm using. And this time I have my right hand on the bottom. So let's say that I couldn't go any further. I could, but I'm not going to. I'm going to pull my work from my machine, snip my threads, pull my top thread to the bottom, now I'm going to go in from the opposite side. And because I have an industrial, I really need to pull out a lot of excess thread so that I can hold it nice and taut. And I'm going to now insert my bag from the other side that I did from the very beginning. And when I insert my thread, or when I insert my needle, it's going to go in the last needle hole that I finished in, that I pulled my work from, and then I pulled to the wrong side. So I'm going to try my best with Essex linen. There's a lot of white mixed in, and I'm using white thread and a gray needle, so it hurts my eyeballs a little bit, but we will get there in the end. So now I have all that. I'm going to really press down on everything to keep it nice and taut, and then I will just finish my seam. Sorry, I know you're wiggling. And then I'm going to rotate, tack down my seam allowance, go backwards, and ta-da. So now that I have finished that seam, and I now need to connect these two, I'm going to pull my thread to the wrong side, and knot them together, and then melt that thread. If you're not using bonded thread, I recommend using glue to secure that knot after you have tied it all together. And then you'll be good to go. And from the exterior of your bag, it's going to look nice and seamless. So the body of our bag has been constructed. And if you haven't already, make sure that you mark or notch your center markings on your main panel, the top and the bottom. We're looking through the bottom right now. And then also make sure that you do it on the base. Now for adding the base to your bag, I do recommend using staples, because it is like a sharply angled kind of bag there, and so it wants to pull away from the base. So staples just are really helpful. So the size of this bag is a little large, so that means it's going to be a little hard for me to show you everything fully in the frame, but I'm going to try my best. So because this is going to be, my cat paws are kind of directional, I need to plan how it goes on my bag. So sometimes it's just, instead of like hurting your brain a little bit, just install it and see what happens when it flips out. So when somebody flips up the bag from the main panel, they're going to see the paws pointing down, and so I want it the other way. So now if I were to install it this way, when they flip it from the front, they'll see the paws going the right way. These are the kind of things that I'm picky about, that nobody else cares about, but I do. So I'm going to staple here, aligning those center markings, right sides together, the main panel and the base. And I'm going to staple at 1/8 of an inch here. I don't want to go deeper than that because I want to be able to cut them off later. I don't want to have to remove all the staples if I can avoid it. So now I'm going to go across the other side, match up those center markings, and again staple. Then I'm going to match up the center markings with this base with the side panel seam. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to staple along all these straight edges until the material starts to pull away from this curved edge. And this is going to be for every corner. So essentially I'm going to staple from here to here, here to here, and again on the other two sides. And I'm going to leave these curved corners, these rounded corners of the base, I'm going to leave them unattached for now until we do some snips so that we can ease this body to the base. So now we're going to make some snips into this main panel. Now you want to keep your snips about 1/4 inch deep and 1/4 inch apart. Now you can, those two measurements are pretty flexible but you may need more or less distance between your snips depending on the material that you're using. If you're using a stretchy faux leather, then you may see that you need less snips, but just make sure that you are snipping so that you can properly ease it. And then when you get to this point, don't snip directly into this seam. Snip before and after it, and then try to avoid your top stitching here. That was the point of keeping this about 1/4 of an inch up. It's so that you can hopefully avoid it when you're doing your snips. You can see here, everything is nice and intact, and I don't have to worry about my seam coming unraveled. So now that I have my snips done on all 4 corners, I'm going to ease each section of snips into each rounded corner. So you can see that we needed to expand this curve to match this curve. And so those snips allow you to press into that base and match up that curve. And then you can start stapling. So you can see we have a nicely eased rounded corner there. And so we expanded this curve just at the edge so we can ease everything correctly, but when we sew this 3/8 inch seam allowance, everything is going to be really nice and smooth and match up well. And so that's exactly what we're going for. So staple all the remaining 3 corners just like you did on this one. So depending on the accuracy of sewing, of cutting, of everything, like cutting your pattern pieces, all that stuff, you might have a tiny little bit of excess here where this seam meets up. That's fine. You can just snip that down. Just like that. And that way you make sure that you have a nice, even seam to follow at the machine. So with everything eased, we will then take this to the machine and sew along this base using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now, we're also going to sew a second seam right next to that, between the edge of your material and the previous seam. Okay, so you're going to go inside of that seam allowance. So I'm going to start by, I like to start mine actually in the back, and I will start in the middle of the back edge. I'm going to drop my seam allowance down to about a 3.5, and then I'm just going to sew along this edge. Now you have a layer of interfacing, Thermolam, Duckaville Light, and Duckaville Heavy kind of just outside of your seam, and that's going to make your presser foot kind of do this number right here, and when it does that, it means that it really wants to go over, and so it will make technically your seam allowance a little bit shorter than 3/8. That's not what we want, so you really need to try and be careful and sort of force it to do what you want it to do. Whenever I reposition or rotate my bag or anything, I'm always going to stop with my needle in the down position and then lift my presser foot up. When it comes to the corner like this, I'm going to kind of pinch it and press it down. And that's going to help me sort of guide it along without any puckers. And I'm going to rotate and kind of go every one stitch at a time. And I'm going to just keep going. And then I'm going over my first seam, so I'm going to backstitch. And I'm going to continue on. So I've now reached the beginning part of my seam, and I need to now grade up and out to be right next to it, and then I'm just going to repeat that whole process again. Now that I have reached the beginning of that new seam, I'm just going to backstitch, and then I'm all done. So you see I have 2 seams here on the base of the bag. Got away from me a little bit right there, but everywhere else I'm pretty happy with. And so now we need to do some trimming. Now I like to trim off all my straight edges first, then remove the staples from my rounded corners, and then I snip my notches into these rounded corners. So I will do that now, and then I'll just show you where I do the notches. So as you can see, my stapled sections are all nicely intact, so that makes for easy cleanup. And now I'm going to remove all the staples from my rounded corners. So this is what I'm left with. And whenever I tell you to use your snips as a guide to cut your darts, that's essentially meaning that's where we needed to expand, which means that's where the curve is. And so for it to sit nicely inside of the bag, we now need to reduce that curve. And so we need to snip notches into each one, or into each section that we expanded. So I've got all my snips in there. They're not perfect. That's okay. We just needed something that serves the purpose of allowing this seam here to reduce when we turn it right side out. So I'm going to turn mine right side out. I'm going to go give it a good press, and then we'll see how everything turned out. So we're all nice and pressed, removed all the wrinkles. Essex linen is very forgiving for wrinkling and stuff like that. The texture and the type of material and the look of the material really masks things like that. Really nice. But even still, lighter weight, something like Mora, things like that, not very stiff materials will fare a lot better in that situation. And so now we are good to go. But before I move on, I did want to point out that when I'm telling you to press your bag at this point, I'm telling you to press it so that you have 4 sides. So I want you to lay your bag flat on your side panels, press it there, and lay your bag flat on your main panels and press it there. And when you're finished your bag, I also give you instructions on how to do what I call a squish. And so what I mean by a squish is I want you to take your bag and push it like this. And what that does is, you can see it does really change the way that the bag lays. And it will do that with time, because we're training it, because I'm using the characteristics of Decaville Light or Profuse Stiff that will wrinkle and heavy folds and creases with time and with encouragement. That's why I don't like to use it in the body of a bag, because that, like for a whole main panel, because it will wrinkle and hold that wrinkle over time. And it's just, that's not what I'm going for when I'm making a bag. But when you're using it for something like this, you can kind of train it and force it to do that wrinkle, and it gives you the shape that we're going for. If your Adena looks like this, that wasn't the shape it was designed to be. When it looks like this, that is. It's a subtle, small difference that has a big impact. So if you can, just try and keep that in mind when you're finished your bag, and it should hold. Even while you're wearing it, the weight is going to pull up on the strap, and it's going to help it do this with time anyway. And that's what we're going for. So now we're done with the exterior assembly, and we can move on to the magnet bridges. For the magnet bridges, you will need both upper lining pieces, both magnet bridges, the 2 magnet bridge backing pieces. These are 1 1/4 by 4 inches, and that is your Decaville Light or Profuse Stiff, 4 rivets, and your magnets. Now again, you can use either the pronged ones like I will be using, or the rivet backed ones. I'm only going to go over the pronged ones in this tutorial, but there are in-depth instructions and lots of photos for installing the rivet ones. So the first step in your magnet bridges is to draw some lines on the wrong side. So you see I already have my stabilizer on there. I can never get my stabilizer perfectly centered, but that's okay. It has wiggle room. So don't stress about it too much. I don't. I always have great results, and mine are never perfectly straight, but they are centered, at least for the most part, in the initial box that you drew in the prep work section. So obviously we're not dealing with the perfect rectangle here, so you need to reference specific parts when you're creating these measurements. So for this center line, it's going to be 1 inch in from these shorter sections right here. Let's see, that's where my center line is. For the second edge here, you're going to measure in 1 inch from this outermost edge on each side and draw a line. Now, if you have a hard time getting that lined up there, you can also measure 5/8 from these shorter edges if that's easier for you. And so then you're going to notch the longer or the shorter of the two sides. So we have this one and this one. You're going to notch this one, and that's just going to help kind of give something to reference, because it is important that we fold these things in a specific manner so that we have a nice smooth finish and things get caught in the seam when we sew it in place. So this bottom edge, this notched edge right here is the bottom of your magnet bridge. So when you fold everything like this, this ends up being folded on top, and this is on the bottom. Now it's important that you do these things so that everything is oriented correctly, and this ends up getting caught in the seam later on. So the reason why we notch that edge is just, again, to have something quick to reference to make sure we're doing things correctly. So after you have notched that bottom edge of your magnet bridge, you need to apply some double-sided tape to the bottom or to the wrong side of your magnet bridge. It's essentially going to be along all areas of the either long edge of their magnet bridge. There's no need to add them in this these slanted sections right here, but you do want them to be on these straighter edges. First thing I'm going to do is remove the double-sided tape backings from this longer edge here, the non-notched side. And I'm going to fold that to that 1 inch marking on the opposing side, just like that. Just like that. Focus, please. And I'm going to meet these shorter straight edges with this center line that I drew. Just like that. And I'm going to roll it, make sure it's nice and adhered and as flat as it can be. So that's what we're going for. And we're going to top stitch along this folded edge here using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. So you can see I've top stitched this edge. So now we're going to remove the double-sided tape backings from the other side. We're going to remove this adhered section right here. And now we're going to fold this in to meet that line. Now my line, you can see it maybe just under that seam, which would make sense with the seam allowances and all the lines and the size of the magnet bridge. That's what we're going for. And so what I do is I butt it up as close to that seam in there as I can, so that I'm matching that line like I want to, which means that when I fold in the center section or these side sections like this, they should comfortably meet that center line like that. So now again, I'm going to roll it, try and get everything as flat and adhered as I can. And then I'm going to keep this pulled out of the way, and I'm going to sew along this edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now to get everything here to lay nice and flat, because like if we were to lay this down, you see it's a bit bulky, and that's because this notched edge is butted so close up to this seam that nothing is really laying flat. So we want to pull this back and trim down this notched edge about 1/8 of an inch. So essentially just cut off that double-sided tape. And now you'll see that everything will lay nice and flat like that. And that's what we want. So we're going to do all of that again on the other magnet bridge. So now that we have prepped both of the magnet bridges, we need to find the center of both the length and the height here. Once you have that center marking done, you need to use your washers for your magnet and trace your slots that you will need to cut to insert the magnet prongs. Now you're going to need to open this back up and carefully cut into your slots here. Now we're going to insert the magnet halves. It doesn't matter which one. I don't really pay attention to which part is attached to the front or the back of the bag, but if you care about all of those details for your magnet, absolutely make note of that while you install. If you have a magnet bridge that you want to go on the front of your bag, just keep that in mind. Once I get my magnets installed, I like to take this to my little metal block and give it a gentle hammer with my leatherworking hammer to really flatten and tighten those prongs against the magnet. And so I'm going to do that now. So now you're going to need your glue again, whichever glue you like that will have a good permanent hold. And we're going to glue first the underside, so the bottom between the prongs and the first layer, and then we're going to fold over this top layer and glue that. And then I press that down slightly to make sure that it's kind of spread throughout just the center section. Again, these are going to be sewn into your bag, so I'm not worried about them. I'm worried about making sure this is nice and flat and as fully adhered as possible. So if you want, you can pull off this double-sided tape. Then I will again apply another layer of glue, and I'm not being real stingy with my glue. And then I will adhere it like that, and then clip it. I like to use these clips because they go the width or the height, the full height of the magnet bridge, and they have a kind of thick opening right there that doesn't leave specific imprints on my material while it dries. So I'm going to repeat all that gluing I just did on this other magnet bridge. I'm going to let them sit for about 15 to 20 minutes to let the glue dry as much as possible, enough to where it's not goopy and gooey while I am sewing it. And then we'll move on to installing them into the upper lining. So once my magnet bridges have gotten to a good point with the glue setting, I like to put them in between two rulers so that the magnet itself can sink in between that, and I can have a nice flat adhesion while it sets. So I'll put them like that, and then I'll put something heavy on top of it, such as my handy dandy metal block and my leatherworking hammer, and I just set that aside while it dries and I move on to the next step. If you don't have a metal block or something heavy like this, you can always use something like a few books and then put something heavy on top of that, or something. You just want to get a really nice adhesion on those. So while you're waiting on the glue to dry on the magnet bridges, you need to draw your contoured line here. Again, it's just like we did on the exterior. You're going to measure in 3/4 of an inch, make some dashes, and then connect those lines. Doesn't have to be pretty, just has to be fairly accurate. So after you have drawn that 3/4 inch line, you need to make the marks for the slots that we're going to cut so we can install the magnet bridges into the upper linings. So those slots are going to be 1 inch tall, they're going to be 2 inches apart, and they're going to be 1 inch up from the bottom edge of the upper lining. And so the way that I explain to you to do that in the pattern is I tell you to measure, place your ruler, measure, pull it up 2 inches and 1 inch over from the center line. If you have one of these 1.25 inch rulers, they're typically used for quilting a lot, but I find myself using it quite a bit. Having that extra bit past the 1 inch really comes in handy. And so again, we didn't draw anything in this bottom 1 inch, and we just traced the 1 inch marking here on the left side of the ruler. And again, since this is my center marking right here on this 1 inch line, it is technically 1 inch over from the center marking, which means that when I do the same thing on the other side, it will now make those two slots 2 inches apart. So now that we've drawn those, we need to cut them. So you can use scissors, you can use a blade, or you can use a rotary blade. If you use a rotary blade, you need to be extra careful because it's very easy to overcut with a rotary blade. I do it, but I only kind of penetrate in the middle of the slot, and then I slightly rock it back and forth with my rotary blade to get close to the edges, and then I finish it with my scissors. So if you want to do that, absolutely you can do that. Just be extra careful you don't cut past your drawn lines. So I have those slots cut on both of my upper linings, and you can also see that I melted away some of this fusible fleece on the wrong side of those cut slots. This kind of helps it so that that fusible fleece isn't poking out when I install my magnet bridge and there's not a bunch of fuzzies right there. That's optional, that's just what I like to do. And then once I get done doing that, which another side note is that it helps you see where the cut slot is too. But then I also measure over 1 inch from each cut slot and I draw a vertical line. Now this doesn't have to be perfectly in line with your cut slot. It just needs to be a reference for you to know how far into the upper lining to insert your magnet bridge. So before we insert the magnet bridge, we're going to put some double-sided tape here just inside of this red line, and then we will be able to put our magnet bridges in. So when it is time to insert your magnet bridge, you want to make sure that this longer folded edge is pointing down to the bottom of the upper lining. If you point it up, that edge will be seen when the bag is finished. So when you install it correctly, you'll see you have a nice smooth finish. No one's ever going to see this bottom edge of the magnet bridge once everything's installed, so just make sure that you insert it correctly. Now we're going to insert it into the slots. And of course the magnet should be facing up and out. Then we're going to flip it over, and just like it's adhered here, we're going to align this cut edge of the magnet bridge with the red line, or that 1 inch line that we drew on the wrong side of the upper lining, and we're going to adhere. Now my glue wasn't fully dry because I'm being impatient for the video, moving forward recklessly, but we want to make sure that if your magnet bridge is coming apart like that, like mine is, then you really want to make sure that you clip it and let it sit for just a little bit longer. I let them dry for approximately 5 more minutes, which is probably nowhere near enough, but I'm impatient, so we're moving along. So when you are done installing the magnet bridges and having them adhered to the line that we drew, the 2 lines we drew, you need to take your MB backing or your magnet bridge backing, and you need to fuse it over the wrong side between those 2 pieces. Now depending on your cut lines or where your slots were, if you cut on them, in them, outside of them, and same thing with where you adhered your thing, it's going to be off maybe by 1/8 of an inch, a little bit less, or it could be spot on. Either way, you need to install and fuse the backing to the back of the magnet bridge as I have. And this is going to close up that hole for us when we sew on either side of that cut slot on the front of the magnet bridge. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to use this edge and we're going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from each cut slot on each side of each magnet bridge. Now we're going to use an 1/8 inch seam allowance, and what I like to do is start from one side, go up, and then go right back down in my needle holes as much as I can. So as you can see, I have top stitched along each slot of each magnet bridge. I've pulled all my thread tails to the wrong side, knotted them, and melted that knot to secure it. With that layer of Decaville light back there, it closes up those holes from that slot that we made. Sewing that Decaville light down, permanently closed it, and now what we're going to do is add in the rivets on either side so that it's even more secure. So you can measure this if you would like to. I typically just eyeball it. You want to make sure that it is centered along the height of the cut slot and about a 1/2 inch away. So then we're going to punch holes in all 4 of those marks, insert and set our rivets, and then we're ready to move on. So with both of our rivets installed on both pieces, now the magnet bridges are done. I do recommend re-clipping this. Again, most glues are going to need a little bit more time to dry, so just give yourself that extra time of it being clipped and super secure, and then when it's time to sew them together for the lining assembly, we can unclip it and it should be good to go. For the dual pocket overlay, you will need your one lower lining piece, your dual pocket overlay, your zipper pocket lining, your slip pocket lining, your length of number 5 nylon zipper tape, and your number 5 nylon zipper pull. Now, with such contrasting materials in my lighting and recording, I don't know how great this section is going to be for you visually. I'm hoping for the best, so let's move forward. So the first step will be to find the top center of your lower lining. Once you find that, if you have a 6-inch ruler, your life is going to be a lot easier. So then you take your 6-inch ruler, you center it on that marking right there, push your ruler down until it's 7/8 of an inch into the lower lining while centered on that center marking, and then you trace the bottom 3 edges of your ruler. Now, if you don't have a 6-inch ruler, you can just use a regular ruler and then draw that centered 6-inch line there, and then measure and then draw those 2 vertical lines as I instruct in the pattern. But having this little guy is pretty handy. Next up, I recommend marking the tops and bottoms of the wrong side of both the zipper and slip pocket linings. This is just going to help you know that you're applying the right edge at the right time, and also really helpful for those using directional materials for their pocket lining. This will ensure that when you open up the pocket, what you see that's on the back side of the bag is going to be the correct direction and oriented correctly once everything is sewn together. Next up will be to draw some lines on the bottom of the wrong side of your slip pocket lining. Then you will apply some double-sided tape around some of these outer edges of the dual pocket overlay. Now you can put more or less than I have, that's totally up to you. The point is just that we want to be able to stick it onto the lower lining so it stays in place while we stitch it on. Now because of that, I don't suggest using any more than 1/8 of an inch double-sided tape. And again, you can apply as much as you want, just make sure you keep it to these outer edges and don't put any on the inside just yet. So now we're going to take off the backings from the double-sided tape that we put on the wrong side of the dual pocket overlay. And we're going to take that and just align that opening with the rectangle we drew. This top edge should meet the top edge of the lower lining, and everything else should be nice and smooth and centered. So now we're going to top stitch along this outer edge using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now don't top stitch parallel to this top edge, and top stitch or back stitch neatly within 3/8 of an inch of this top edge as well. Okay, you want to back stitch so you secure your stitch, but you don't want to back stitch too far so that it's seen once we sew this seam together with the upper lining, okay? So with that top stitch, it's not perfect, but it'll do. All we have to do now is trim away the lower lining from behind the dual pocket overlay. Now you want to leave behind about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more if you really need to, if you feel like you need to, but truly 1/8 of an inch is all that you need. The big important part here is to not cut into your dual pocket overlay. That's most important as you go down these angled sides because we have that slot cut right there. So it does make it a little bit more scary to cut by. So just constantly check and be careful. Don't put your fingers in front of your scissors, but just be mindful so that you don't cut your overlay, because then you have a lot more work to do. After you've trimmed that away, we do have some double-sided tape that we need to apply. Now, there's a whole diagram and picture to show you everything step by step in the pattern, but you would install right above this first top line. You want to extend it past this zipper window here, because that's what this is going to be. So then, if you can see, there's a stabilizer piece on top of the cut slot for the slip pocket. Right below that stabilizer piece, you want to put some double-sided tape. Now, you should keep it in between these 2 holes that you punched, just so that it's holding exactly what it needs to and it doesn't hold anything else. So this is going to be about 1/4 inch below this cut slot that we have right there. And then you want to put 2 vertical strips on either side of the zipper window. That's just going to help us keep everything nice and centered. And next up is the lines that we drew on the bottom of the wrong side of the slip pocket lining. We need to install some, or put on some double-sided tape right there in between those 2 vertical marks. So once you have that done, you're going to snip right into those vertical marks about halfway. Just like that. Then you're going to remove this double-sided tape backing on the back of the slip pocket lining. You're going to fold this center section up to meet that drawn line. Now you can press it, you can roll it, but we just want it to be nice and flat. Now I'm going to roll it first. Then I'm going to go give it a nice little press. So there is that edge folded over and creased. So now I want it so that the folded edge is wrong sides together with the lower lining. And I'm going to remove this double-sided tape backing from below that slip pocket stabilizer. And I'm going to align this folded edge with the bottom edge of the slip pocket slot. And that is going to put these the flipped up sections right next to either side of that cut slot. Like that. Should be pretty level there. So if we look from the inside, well, you probably can't see because of the colors that I chose, of course, but should be level and it shouldn't be poking up so that you could see it past that slip pocket slot. So now you will top stitch along this bottom edge of the slip pocket opening. Now I want you to stay in between these 2 holes, and I want you to start and end with long thread tails. Now I also want you to backstitch neatly, maybe 1 to 2 stitches on either end, and then when you're done, pull all those thread tails together and knot them on the wrong side. So you can see I have done that top stitching, and on the wrong side they have been knotted and melted. And so now what I'm going to do is trim back the top sections down to meet this top line that we drew. And oh, I forgot a bit of double-sided tape. Okay, I'm sorry. Those of you following the pattern are probably like, Shannon, you forgot it. I know. Okay, so we're going to install or put this double-sided tape right below this red line, right in between those 2 holes that we punched on either side of the slip pocket opening. I am so sorry. I have the pattern open right next to me so I don't forget anything, and here we are. So if you forgot like me, or you're following this tutorial, then you just put this on there. So you just take that double-sided tape backing off, and we are going to fold up this top edge of the slip pocket slot to meet that drawn red line right there, and adhere it to that double-sided tape. So now I want you to give this a nice little press so that this pocket is nice and flat. Okay, we have a happy flat little pocket here. So we will now top stitch along this top edge of the slip pocket. Now use the same seam allowance you used for these 2 other seams that we did, and make sure that you top stitch between just those 2 punched holes. Make sure you backstitch well, and then pull all the threads to the wrong side, knot them together, and secure them either by melting or putting a dab of glue on them. So we've sewn that top seam, and so now the top stitching part of the slip pocket is finished. All we have to do now is to lift up the side of our lower lining and sew along each edge here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So with those seams all sewn up, that slip pocket is done. So moving on to the zipper pocket, we're going to take our zipper tape and our zipper pocket lining, and we're going to have them both right side up. You can see here's the B on the wrong side. And then we're going to align the zipper tape along the bottom edge and clip together. So if you wanted to, you could replace these clips with double-sided tape. That's totally fine. I just used clips here, but you would then baste this bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, not the normal 1/8 inch seam allowance that we normally baste with. So I have the zipper basted on as I've called for. And then I also tell you to draw some vertical lines alongside the zipper window here. So it's going to be 3/4 of an inch away and vertical. And this is just a reference line to help us center everything. And so now we're going to remove these double-sided tape backings that we have left on the backside of the dual pocket overlay. And then we're going to take our zipper tape with our lining basted on and flip it, and then attach it using those lines to help center it and place it on the wrong side of the lower lining. Now, depending on your zipper tape, it may or may not fit perfectly, but you just need to try your best. So I have that adhered. Now I'm going to look at the front side and see how straight it is. Which, who knows? It should be straight, but sometimes with how flexible zipper tape is, it can be hard to get it truly straight without looking at it from the front side. So that's why I always like to double check and make sure that it is as even as I could make it. All right, so I'm happy with that, and so I'm going to turn it to the wrong side. And then I'm going to fold this pocket lining down. Now the goal here is to have your zipper pocket lining fold be 7/8 of an inch from this top edge. That is what that opening is here on this zipper overlay, so that's what we want to be in line with. So take your ruler, place it on there, align the top edge with that 7/8 inch marking, and then fold your material down right up against that line. Crease it as best you can with your fingers before we go and press it with the iron. And then after we get that pressed at the iron, we will double check our depth and make sure everything is where we want it to be. All right, so I gave it a quick press, and then I'm going to push the ruler right up against the fold and then push it back down on that zipper tape. And so that's fine with me. The 7/8 inch goes across to both sides. So that means when we do this top stitching on the lower part of the zipper pocket lining, or I should say below the zipper window, what's going to happen is we're going to catch all layers, including this folded edge. If you were to fold it further down, like 1 inch, you would probably completely miss it in that top stitching. So it's pretty important that you achieve that 7/8 inch depth from the top of the zipper pocket, or the zipper tape, to the top fold of the zipper pocket lining. And then once you get done with that, we're going to top stitch along this bottom edge. So this is going to be very similar to how we top stitch a normal overlay. So the way that I normally do overlays is we'll top stitch this bottom edge right here, pull the thread tails to the wrong side, insert the zipper pull, and then top stitch these 3 top sides. And we're going to do the exact same thing here with this dual pocket overlay. And that's going to give us a clean finish, no visible raw edges when you open the pocket, and it's going to keep things bulk free. As you can see, I've sewn that bottom edge there. I actually use a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch because that's my preference, but 1/8 of an inch will work perfectly fine with all these seams. As you can see, you still have wiggle room, even if you're like me and you use less than 1/8. If you did do the full 1/8, you would still have room without any overlapping. And so I went about 1/8 of an inch past each side of the zipper window. And I left long tails that I didn't backstitch, so I will pull them to the wrong side and knot them together. And on the wrong side, you can see that I was able to catch my zipper pocket lining in my top stitching, and that's the important part. It would be even more secure if I did that full 1/8 inch, but as long as it's 7/8 inches from this top zipper, then that should match the overlay because that's how the overlay was designed, and you should be able to catch it just fine. So now I'm going to pull these thread tails to the wrong side and knot them together and then secure that knot. So now that I have those secured, I want to install my zipper pull. I'm going to pull this back And I'm going to just install my zipper pull. When you install your zipper pull, try to make sure that this gap right here is even so that you have a nice even zipper. If you notice that one bump is bigger than on one side versus the other, that means your zipper was installed crooked. So we're just going to pretend that I didn't just tell you to just top stitch all this. We need to first fold up the upper lining. And in my pulling out of my stitches, I snipped into my zipper tape, which I'm going to have to melt and secure. So we're going to fold up the top edge of the zipper pocket lining to meet the top edge of the lower lining, and we're going to clip along that edge. Again, if you wanted to use double-sided tape there, that is your prerogative. We're going to press this to be nice and flat, just like this slip pocket lining. And then we'll actually move on to top stitching like we're supposed to. All right, now that it's happily pressed, we can look at the right side. And even though you don't know this, I did tell you before that you should be top stitching these top 3 sides of your overlay. So you're going to insert your needle in this first needle hole from this bottom stitch line. It could be this one. It doesn't really matter which direction you're going to do it. But then you will go up the short side of the zipper pocket window, across the top edge, and then back down to end your stitching in the opposing needle hole of the bottom seam. Now leave long tails, and then when you're done, pull those thread tails to the wrong side and knot and secure them together. So as you can see, if you start and end in your previous stitch line, it gives a really nice seamless look from the right side of your material, and you can see on the wrong side it has been knotted and secured, and it was just this upper section here that was top stitched. Now if you're like me and you were using a industrial to sew this seam right here, I do suggest that you go through and kind of snip into your stitches here every so many stitches, and then you'll just pull. Be careful not to go into your zipper tape. Just your stitches here. And what this is going to do is this is going to release some of that tension on the zipper tape, and that's going to give you, it's going to help prevent any wrinkling that would happen from sewing such a thin material with such thick thread and such a large needle, which is overly necessary for one layer of waterproof canvas and your zipper tape. So we are almost done with the dual pocket overlay. What we have to do now is just like we did on the slip pocket, we need to do that on the zipper pocket lining. We need to sew along this edge right here using a 3/8 inch seam allowance on both sides. So now that we have closed up those zipper pocket lining sides, that part's done, and the only thing we have left to do is to make a center mark in the middle of your zipper tape here, and that should be pretty accurate. You can always fold this right sides together if you want to do that, but if you found your center marking before and you installed your overlay correctly, then your center marking should be fairly accurate. I hope that you enjoyed making that pocket. It's probably one of my favorite parts of the Adena. I just like how everything turned out. I love how everything aligns, and it makes for a really nice compact pocket that honestly feels just as fast as a normal overlay, but now you get 2 pockets out of it. So anyway, I hope you like it. Now it's time for the lining assembly. And although this was just seconds for you, this has been over a whole weekend for me, almost 5 days since I recorded the last section. So please bear with me as I jump back into things. But for the lining assembly, you will need both upper linings, both lower linings, and both inner strap panels. You'll also need your last 2 of the 4-point stabilizers. And before we get sewing, make sure that you draw those 3/4 inch offset contoured lines, and also make sure that you draw those seam allowance markings along those bottom angled edges So we're going to set these inner strap panels aside, and then we're going to grab our upper lining and lower lining with the pocket, the dual pocket overlay installed. So you will simply place these right sides together and then clip along this length. So now that you have this top edge clipped together, you're going to sew along this seam here from edge to edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I can't remember if I told you that I use my zipper foot just for this portion or not, and my industrial for this portion, but that is what I did. I just find it easier to turn around and sew at my domestic with the zipper foot on there and the nice thin seam that is the zipper. There's a zipper tape with those other 2 layers. And it just is easier for me, but do things to your own preference. You can absolutely use your one machine to sew along this whole seam. So once you get done with that, when we flip it up, you can see we have a nice even seam allowance. That looks so nice. Now before we top stitch that seam, we're going to just trim down this area right here using our scissors and just angling the seam a bit. It's just going to remove some of that excess seam allowance there and just kind of further gives us some more bulk reduction around that point of the inner strap panel. And then we'll flip it up like that. So now we'll just top stitch along this upper lining using a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure that that seam allowance is pointing up. We want to catch that in that top stitching. I also like to start and end my top stitching parallel to the upper lining over here, just so that if we do any trimming, it doesn't get snipped off and your top stitching stays nice and secure. So you can see I have my seam top stitched here, and then you're going to repeat that whole process on the second pair of upper and lower linings. So we're going to take the back assembled lining panel, and that one is going to be the one with this dual pocket overlay, and we're going to align the shorter of the inner strap panels along this edge right here and clip. So once you have this seam clipped, you're going to insert your needle here in this point, and you're going to sew all the way up to this edge here so that you meet up with this little point here on the upper lining. Make sure that you don't cross your drawn seam allowance here where those 2 lines intersect. Don't go past that. And then backstitch well at the beginning and the end. So now I have sewn on this, and you'll see it matches quite nicely up there. So we're going to grab our other lining panel, and we're going to flip it right sides together with the one we just sewed on. And we're going to align this inner strap panel here with this side of the lining. We're going to clip just like we did before. Once it gets closer down to this point, I do like to add a little bit or a couple staples here just to make sure everything lines up nicely as I sew. And so in case that was out of focus, those are the 2 staples. Again, I put them closer just to keep everything nice and secure. And again, we have both lining panels attaching here. So make sure everything is lined up as well as you can, and that's going to help make sure everything lines up with the side panel, with the sides of the lining later on. So now that that's ready to go, we're again going to sew along this inner strap panel edge, and we're going to use that 3/8 inch seam allowance, but this time we're going to start up here and sew along this edge to meet in that point. Again, don't cross it, go slowly, be careful, and then we'll move right on. So you can see we have a really nice top of this seam here, and that's what we're going for. And what's left is to sew along this side down here. So the way in which we do that is we're going to flip these right sides together. And then we're going to match up this bottom corner and then clip along this lower lining edge. And once we reach this area where the upper and lower lining seam is, I like to take my time and really try and get everything as nicely aligned as I can and staple it all together. So I'll do that. So now that I have everything clipped, because I want to use this edge for my seam allowance guide, I'm going to sew starting from this point of the lower lining, and I'm going to sew up this edge using a 3/8 inch seam allowance until I reach this stitching right down here, which is the edge of this angled stitching where we drew that line. Now it's important that you don't cross over that. Although it is a little bit more forgiving than you expect it to be, it's best to just try and angle to just stop stitching as soon as you reach this previous stitch line. Don't cross over into it. That is just best practice there. And while you're doing this, also make sure that this seam allowance down here is either angled or clipped or stapled out of the way while you sew. It should be able to be pretty much completely avoided while sewing, but just be mindful of it, just to be careful. Be safe rather than sorry. And again, you're going to hit right about there and then stop. As you go over this seam here, it is a little bulky, so use a hump jumper just to make sure that nothing gets bunched and pulled as you go, which can contribute to that seam not lining up when you're done. So you can see that I've sewn up the side seam, and I've backstitched well at the beginning and the end, and I made sure that it didn't cross over my seam here where those two lines intersect. And then when we open it, we see that I have a nice point here as well as a nice meetup there. Now before we move on, if you use staples, make sure that you remove those from your material before we do any top stitching or pressing. And then I want you to do a little bit of trimming. Do you see how when we open this up, there is a bulge right here? What we're going to do is remove that bulge. Now that bulge is not on the inner strap panel, it is only on the upper linings. So we're going to make a snip here into this side here, right where this material kind of angles, like this edge right here. That's over here. We're just going to snip a notch into the seam allowance and remove that so that later when we press everything nice and flat, we no longer have that bulge. Everything lies nice and smooth. So we're going to do that on both sides of this seam. You can see now when we lay these down, we have more of what we want and less of what we don't want. So now that we have those snips done and we have a nice smooth edge up there, we're going to also press this seam down here the best that we can. So I have my seam nicely pressed. So just like we did on the outer strap panels, we're going to trim down the point stabilizers to mimic a cone shape. Then we're going to fuse it right on top like this. So our point stabilizer is fused, nice and crooked. That works for me. So then when you look from the front, you'll see we have a really nice point here. The seam matches up nicely and everything is nice and smooth down the seam. So this is exactly what we're looking for. So now on the wrong side again, we're going to do the similar trimming that we did before, like on the outer strap panels, where you will snip into the inner strap panel this time versus the side accent, like that, following this kind of angle here. And then you want to snip a little bit into the other layer, about half as much. And then you want to trim them both down by about 1/8 of an inch so that you are left over with about 1/4 inch seam allowance after you've trimmed. Then you want to clip these open. This is what everything should look like. Then we're going to flip this whole thing over. So when you top stitch, you're going to start on either side. I tend to start on the left side so that I can go, I can start and do my parallel stitching like we did on the outer strap panels, and then I'll use this seam here as my 1/8 inch seam allowance guide, and I'm going to top stitch along the upper lining. I'm going to go down here along this side seam. Once I hit this top stitching, I'm going to follow it down to this center point, back up slightly onto this upper lining. I'm going to go back up, all the way back up this side, and then I'm going to finish again going parallel to this edge. So here we are. I have started here, followed along this edge, pivoted, went straight down, across, straight back up, pivoted, and then tacked back down up there. So now that we have made sure that we attach the shorter of the two inner strap panels to the left of this lining piece with the dual pocket overlay, we can only install the second longer inner strap panel to the right of it. And that means when we put the lining inside the bag is going to match up with the exterior so that those two longer strap panels hit each other or butt up right against each other, and so do these shorter ones. And that's exactly what we want. So now you're going to take your longer inner strap panel and you're going to repeat this whole process we just did, but now you're going to do that with this longer piece. So again, we're going to attach it here, sew along that side, bring this side here that will be left unattached, and bring the opposing side of our lining to match it. Sew along that side as well. Then sew the side seam, do the trimming, fuse your point stabilizer, and then do your top stitching. That top stitching will be just a little bit more difficult because you're going to be sewing into a cylinder of sorts, just like you were when you finished assembling the body part of the exterior, but it's quite simple and you don't have to worry about coming in from the other side. It's far enough up top and the opening is wide enough for you to be able to comfortably stitch everything. So now that we have both inner strap panels installed onto both upper linings and lower linings, all we have to do now is finish the bottom of the lining. And so the first part of that is going to be to clip along this lower edge. If you wanted to add a little woven tag, you can do that right there in the bottom. That's what I like to do, but you can absolutely put yours somewhere else or not include one. So we're going to clip along this edge and then sew it using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once we're done sewing it, we're going to press it nice and open and flat so that we have a nice bottom seam to the bag. So with this seam sewn and then opened up, you can now move on to your sides of your box bottom. So match up that seam right there and then clip along each side. So now you're going to sew along each side of your boxed bottom using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So on both sides you can see I've sewn along this seam. I have backstitched as I went over the seam, and then when I came back and just did a little bit of reinforcement stitches right there over that seam, and again on this side as well. And so now you can trim down that seam allowance if you want, and then we're going to give the bag, the lining, a really nice press. Okay, so my bag, the lining of my bag is apparently a black hole that my camera does not want to focus on, so just showing you that it exists as an assembled and pressed bag. And so now we get to move on to the last section. So the last section will be the final assembly. And for that, you're going to need your fully assembled exterior, your fully assembled lining, your 1-inch pin buckle with that center bar, and 2 final rivets. So the first step in your final assembly is going to be to apply some double-sided tape right above that drawn line that you made, that offset line, all along the top edge and down these strap portions of both your exterior and your lining. So I've done it on the exterior because it's just a little bit more difficult to show you, but I'm going to show you while I do it on the lining here. So before we get started with applying the double-sided tape, I wanted to take a moment and talk about using either 1/8 inch or a 1/4 inch double-sided tape. Now these are 2 different brands of double-sided tape and they're 2 different thicknesses. And so I personally wouldn't use 1/8 inch double-sided tape for this seam unless it was this specific brand, which is the Wawak Hyperstick. It's essentially like permanent double-sided tape, and I know that my machine can handle it, but I also know it will truly hold those materials together, at least the materials that I'm using. Other double-sided tapes that are very strong, like this one from geekyhardware.com, also known as Wizardry Stitchery. It is very great tape. I love it. You can tear it versus having to cut it, but it is not as strong of a hold as this Hyperstick tape. And so it's not something that I would prefer to use, especially when it's 1/8 inch in size. But the benefit of this is that it behaves a little bit better with domestic machines, and you can completely avoid stitching over it when you install it onto your bag. So really depends on what your machine will tolerate, what you want to do, how much you want to fiddle with it, and all those things. Again, I have an industrial. It is totally fine with double-sided tape, and so I'm going to use my Hyper Stick 1/4 inch, and it's going to hold everything so much easier for me, so I don't have to worry about it coming up from the placement once I fold it over and adhere it to the tape, and I just find it to be really helpful there. But again, use your best judgment for your machine, your materials, and your sanity. So I'm going to take my double-sided tape here, and I'm going to start along this shorter inner strap panel, and I'm just going to apply it right inside of that line. And as we go, and this is for both the lining and the exterior, any seams that you tacked open, like this one right here, keep them open while you apply the double-sided tape. I like to kind of pinch it down as I go, and it helps conform that tape to the curves. So once you get done applying this double-sided tape to the both the lining and the exterior, then you have to do a lot of snipping. Now it doesn't actually take that long, but it is tedious, and I know people are going to hate doing it, but it's pretty important, and if you don't do it, you're going to have a heck of a time sewing it when that time comes to do your final top stitch. So ideally you're going to snip into your seam, into your top edge of both the lining and the exterior. Essentially, for the shorter part of the inner strap panel, it's going to start right there on that edge, go all the way around, and then go into just around the area of your stabilizer here for the inner strap panel. You can do that on both sides of the lining, and the same for the exterior. Just go past this stabilizer about a 1/2 inch or so for this shorter side of the outer strap panel. You don't have to go all the way to the edge there. But keep in mind you want them to be no more than a 1/4 inch deep. If you go further than that, you're probably going to see it when it comes time to fold everything over. And you want to keep them about a 1/4 inch apart. You can do more, you can do less, but I've just found that a 1/4 inch deep and a 1/4 inch apart is pretty good for most seams for the purpose that we need it to. And so you want to do that all along these curved edges here, again until about a 1/2 inch past these stabilizers. So you can see a little bit, here's my stabilizer, and I went a bit further, but it's not really going to have any issue with it going that far. I just wanted to make sure that I finish out that curve and snip past it, just so that any lingering kind of easing that it wants to do, it can comfortably do. So it's not really an issue if you go further than even what I did, but ideally you just want to make sure you go past the stabilizer, because then you're fully into the straight portion of the seam and all of the easing will be completed by that area. So I've got the exterior done as well, and while it's really hard to see the snips on this material, I did make them. You can see them on the wrong side. And then, of course, like I said before, I kept all my seams open, and when I snipped, I did not snip into that parallel stitching up here, and I did not snip directly into either of these seams. That just keeps everything way more secure and stable versus snipping directly into it. So I set my lining aside for now, and I'm going to focus on my exterior only, and I'm going to start folding over those edges. So I'm going to hope that everything stays in focus. So I'm going to remove my double-sided tape backing from one half of my bag until I get just past my stabilizer right there. And that is simply going to help keep my strap from sticking to everything while I work. And so I'm going to fold down this center mark here to meet that drawn line, and I'm going to just press down to adhere it just like that. It's a little hard to show you on the exterior, and I am sorry about that, but we try our best. And so as I go, I'm just going to continue working from the center out, and I'm going to fold over these seams and this entire top edge down to meet that drawn line. Now, as you get closer to this area right here where we eased it, the material is going to be even closer to that foam. So just keep that in mind. And then, again, align it with the marking we have right there. And then press as we go. Now, I like to continue to clip as I go just to make sure everything is it just helps that double-sided tape stick even better to those seams where it's bulky and it wants to pull away. If you had any areas where, it just didn't apply as smoothly, adjust that now. That way you're starting with your best foot forward in that final top stitch. And then I'm going to work again from the center out along those seams, and with that top edge, everything kind of folding down perfectly and meeting that line. And if you kind of not really stretch your material, but kind of just as you fold it, kind of hold it taut, it's going to want to spread and ease as you go. Very similar to the way in which it did on the base, right? Where we snipped and those curves or that straight edge then eased into those rounded corners, just like that. So once I get to this area where I didn't pull off the rest of that tape, I'm going to work on the other side now. So as you can see, all along the interior, you see those little gaps between all those snips. And that shows you how much it needed to ease. Some areas are more, some areas are less, but all areas of these curves need it. And that's just because that's the nature of curves. When you're folding this down, you need it to match this line right here, which is never going to be the same as this cut edge. So it's very important to do those snips, and I will never not recommend it. So now you have everything aligned up until this point. We're going to remove those last bits of double-sided tape backing. And now we don't have to worry about it sticking to everything. And we're just going to fold in those edges to meet that center line. I'm going to give this a good seam roll, make everything nice and flat. And you can continue to seam roll in these areas here. Really get everything nice and adhered. So with my exterior done, I'm going to do that same thing on my lining. So now that we have both top edges folded down to meet that drawn 3/4 inch line, we're going to insert our lining into the exterior. We're not going to turn this right side out. We're going to leave it just like it is, and we're going to leave this just like it is, regardless of whether or not you have a flatbed or some form of cylinder arm or free arm on your machine. We want the bag to stay turned out just like it is. So now that I have it in there, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to align those center markings. There's this red one right here, and there is this one right there. You see I did extend it down just so I could see it just a little bit better. I'm going to match them up. I'm going to meet that top edge so that they are even, and then I'm going to clip to secure. I'm going to do it on the other side as well, and then I'm going to keep matching up this top edge and clipping it as I go. When I hit these seams, I'm going to remove these clips and I'm going to reapply them to, I'm just going to remove them from the exterior and just clip both seams together. So as you approach these inner strap panels, you see when it sits inside one another, this outer strap panel is technically wider than this inner strap panel, and that is by design, and you need to kind of ease the two together. For a very significant portion of the first dozen or more Adenas that I made, there was a lot of wrinkling in here just because we had a curve inside another curve and we had to try and fold it, and when you fold it you see wrinkles happen just like that. And so I had to eliminate that, and the way that I found is it's kind of like when you make a wallet. You match these edges, you have a little bit of a gap here, but then when everything gets folded together it nests nicely. If you can see now, we make it nest, and that's what we want. But when it's wide open it looks shorter, okay, because it is. It's just the nature of how curves work. So it took some engineering, and it seems a little confusing on your end. The goal for you is to just make sure that you align these two edges on each side evenly as you go up, and make sure that again they are in line with one another. So as you are easing everything together, once you hit this point of your shorter of the two strap panels, I want you to measure down and make sure that there is 3 inches of a difference between this edge of the outer strap panel and of the inner strap panel. If this inner strap panel is just a little bit too short or a little bit too long, then trim it down to fit. So I need to trim about 1/8 of an inch off. So this cut edge is going to align with your center bar, and having it 3 inches down is going to make everything line up nicely. So on the other side where my longer strap panel is, I'm again still making sure that everything is lining up between these two edges. And then what I'm going to do is something that is a little bit more of an advanced technique, but it's not that hard. It's just something that you have to take your time with. And so when your Adena is all said and done, your strap is going to lay like this, right? And remember what we just did for those side panels, because there's a curve inside of a curve. When you do this, you get wrinkles, right? My hands are just wonderful models for this. So we need to kind of allow that easing to happen now before we get to sewing, because if not, we're going to trap all those wrinkles in place. So what we want to do is kind of nest this inner strap panel into the outer strap panel on the curve that it's going to become, or in the curve it's going to become. So the Adena, initially the strap was about that length. Through testing, it was determined that it should be longer, so it has been lengthened. That's the word I'm looking for. It's now going to sit closer to up here, right about there once it's installed. The easing that's going to happen is mostly going to happen up here. Down here it's going to be nice and straight. But even just holding it, right? These two straps, when they started out, they were the same length. But even just holding it, I've eased already, and just performing that nesting, I've already eased about 5/8 of an inch. Now, that can be affected, or that amount of easing and nesting, I guess I should use nesting more consistently, but that amount of nesting that's going to happen in there is going to, one, be determined by the thickness of your materials. If you use Decovil light in there versus waterproof canvas, how thick your waterproof canvas is. If you use something like silky, water-resistant canvas that's really fluffy, those things are going to have an impact on how much you're going to ease, right? But I know that my goal is probably going to be about 1/2 an inch, maybe a little bit less. So the way in which I'm going to make this happen and clip it is that I'm going to make sure my bag is standing up. And unfortunately, my camera doesn't get any higher than this. And so I am going to just kind of mimic that curve where I know it's going to go, and I'm going to clip as I go. So as you can see, this bottom part is really nice and smooth, but up here I have a little bit of gaping, and I don't really want that. And so I'm going to actually kind of work it back in there a little bit. I know it hurts some of you to see me unclip, but really kind of nesting this comfortably like this. Normally it's best if you can do it while it's standing up, but this works too. Just don't lay it flat when you do it. So you can see when these are clipped together, it's really nice and smooth. But what happens when we straighten it out? We get those bumps on top. And where the bumps are the biggest is where the apex of that curve is. So I'm going to clip the other side of this seam, double check everything, and grab my backup stash of clips, and then we will continue on getting that nice point we want down there. So as you can see, our strap should turn out quite nicely. And the more clips you apply, the better. The more it's going to ease, the less you have to worry about it being an uneven application of those bumps that I call them in the pattern. I'm going to apply some more down this strap, just make sure everything is nice and happy. So when I first wrote this up, I did this kind of this way, and I never really felt the need to add double-sided tape in between it. But when I wrote up the instructions, I put in there to install double-sided tape between these two layers of the strap, like we normally do in many straps. But the testers were having those bumps on the other underside, and I guess I had always done this easing, but never really pushed it as a thing that should be done. Whenever I did it, I always came up between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch short, and I just trimmed it to fit, and that was initially wrote in the pattern. But I spent a couple days trying to solve the wrinkling on the bottom and consistently for the instructions. And so when I did that, I eliminated applying double-sided tape between those two layers. And that's because it's just a little bit too hard to really see if things are being eased properly, and then it's even harder to fix it, especially depending on the materials that you're using. And so clipping may not be everyone's favorite part of a drop-in lining, especially when you're just adding that in with a strap, because most people don't only clip their strap nowadays. But I did find that this gave me great results. My testers did this with good results as well, and so I just suggest doing it this way. one of my testers did use some contact cement on their bag, and I don't necessarily suggest that either. I don't recommend installing glue between these two layers here. I find that gluing something like this ends up being a permanent solution, and when we sew, we're not perfect enough for most permanent solutions like that. I'd much rather pick out my stitches and try to re-sew my bag together instead of gluing the two layers, and then I can never take it apart again without ruining my material. So use your own best judgment. If you would prefer to glue all of these layers together, if you want to use double-sided tape in here, you can do all that. Your results may vary. That's what I can tell you. I haven't done it, so I can't speak to that end result, and I can only ever recommend what I have personally tried. So now that we have used all the clips that we own, we're going to work on getting this edge here nice and pointed so that it mimics that of the bottom of the strap panel point that we know and love. So first you want to trim down the inner strap panel to match the outer strap panel. And this ended up being 3/8 of an inch, which is what I was expecting it to be. So once I get done trimming that edge down, I'm going to use my ruler and make a center marking here at the very bottom of the strap. Then I'm going to measure up 1 inch, and I'm going to draw little marks on either side of my outer strap panel, and then I will trim it down. But before I move on to trimming, if you are sewing on a flatbed machine, you should be sewing from the inside of your bag so that your bobbin thread shows on the outside. And I know that that is very scary for a lot of people, and I fully understand. But it is way easier than trying to sew from the exterior on this bag. I promise you. So if you're sewing from the inside of your bag, then you need to make these marks on the inner strap panel, not on the outer strap panel, because it's going to be the cut edge you're going to use for your seam allowance, and you need to be able to see that when it's right side up on your machine versus upside down, because then you wouldn't be able to know where the angle starts and stops. So now that I've made those marks, here comes the scary part, which is only on this outer strap panel, right? So leave the inner strap panel alone, and you're going to put your scissors here at this center mark. You're going to angle them. I like to angle it so that my bottom blade really hits on where that marking is. And then I just commit and snip. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. So double check that you're happy with that. I'm actually going to trim off mine just a little bit more so you can see that angle there. It's much better. So now I'm going to do that whole process of marking the center, marking the top sides 1 inch in, and then trimming it down. There we have that second snipped edge. So now that we have both angled edges and we have used the entirety of our clip stash, we are ready to do a little bit of gluing, and then we can jump into top stitching. So if you have a glue that has a needle tip sort of like this, a really fine tip, it's very helpful for this part. So in between where the Decovil Light or the waterproof canvas is and this outer fold of your material, I like to place a little bit of glue in there now before I sew everything up, and it just helps keep everything nice and closed, and I don't really have to worry about any gaping, and I can get further in there than I could after I top stitch, and that really matters most when it comes to edge painting. And then I also like to glue this the outer strap panel to the inner strap panel right on this bottom edge down here. Not a ton, just enough to keep everything together, because it's not going to be as stable towards the point of this outer strap panel, because it just you can't really clip it that well. You're going to be sewing, and while you're sewing, your presser foot might want to move it and such. So I just find it really helpful to place just a bit of glue down there to keep everything nice and sturdy. So yet again, we have traversed the sewing room, which was only a couple feet, and now we are at the machine. Do keep in mind, I am recording with my phone, so the sound quality will be a little lower. You might hear the clangs a little bit more. I don't have a mic on, I'm just using the sound of the camera. Hopefully it doesn't shake too much or I don't hit it. It is on a tripod, so we're hoping for the best. But I figured it would be good to just kind of show you as I go and then kind of tell you the things that I do along the way. Now, obviously I have a cylinder arm here, and if you're using a flatbed, then you're going to be sewing from the inside of your material or your bag, and you're going to be holding and manipulating and doing things with your bag differently than me. I sew on a cylinder arm, and so that's how I am doing my final top stitch. I have done it on the flatbed from the inside. I've also done it on the flatbed from the outside, and that is why I eliminated sewing it from the outside as a recommendation in the machine, because it is a pain. I don't recommend it. But if you're even on a domestic, you'll get by just fine because you can hang the machine off the side of your table because it's portable versus a flatbed industrial. Plenty of testers have sewn from the inside of their bag with great success. The big important part about that is you want to make sure that your tension is spot on, because obviously it will be seen from the exterior. So take some time to get that right. So if you are starting from the inside of your work here, or if you're starting from the inside, this area right here is a lot more problematic for you when it comes to tension, because it's 2 layers versus the 4, and everything else is going to be set up for 4 plus, because you'll have interfacing and stabilizers that are going to come into play. So you just need to take your time. Technically, what I have done and what you can do, but I did not write into the pattern because it just was a little bit more complicated than I was willing to write into, is that you can start your top stitching here if you really wanted to, and go all the way through, all around the other side, and all the way back, and finish right here. This is if you're working from the inside only. And then when you're done, flip it around and just start, leave long tails, pull them to the wrong side, and then when you start again with long tails, and then go up and back down and meet back up in those 2 starting and ending needle holes. And that way you don't have to try to get the perfect tension with a smaller or a thinner amount of materials than what your tension has been set up for. That's an option if you want to. I'm not going to take that. I'll be just fine with however my tension turns out here. It's probably not going to be that bad. And it's something that I can live with, especially with it being my bag. But I do recommend you taking that time if you are sewing from the inside to get all that as good as you can. So you're going to start top stitching your bag on this shorter outer strap panel. Now that's going to help it so that you can pull the threads to the wrong side when you're all finished, and you can have a knot that then gets permanently tucked into the where you attach your pin buckle, versus down here in the loose end of the strap. And so that's where I like to start, but if you want to tie it on the other end, or you want to start on the other end, you are welcome to do that. And so you can draw your seam allowance marking first if you want to, so you know where to pivot on all these. For me, on my cylinder arm, it is tough because I like to use my standard presser foot, which hides a lot of marking, especially when I'm right on top of it. And because it's so wide, it tends to kind of rub it off as it goes. So I tend to just eyeball it. You're welcome to do that, or you can draw it. It's totally up to you. So I got my needle positioned where I want it, and then I'm going to just keep stitching. And then as I get to this corner, I'm going to double check. And I can actually see that I should loosen my tension just a bit. And let's hope I remember to do it when I pivot back. Throughout the entire top stitching of this bag, I'm going to make sure that I don't remove my next clip until I am right in front of it. I don't want to break my clips, but I do want to preserve all the locations and all of the easing and all the placements and all the centering and everything with as I've clipped it before. I've already done all the hard work because I don't want to undo any of it. It just takes some time to get through the bag when you're taking it off clip by clip, but it is very important. So I'm going to keep everything as aligned as I can. And on these inner strap panels where we had to ease them because of that, like that nesting that took place, that is going to want to pull away from you a little bit, but just again, keep everything as aligned as you can. Now I have a needle positioner on my cylinder arm and my flatbed, so these kinds of things are easy for me. That doesn't go there, because I can take it one stitch at a time. If you don't have a needle positioner and you're hand cranking through most of these curves, it will take you much longer. But if your domestic machine allows you to take a really slow speed like this, I do recommend it. It's one of those things where it's just worth it to take your time. As I go over these seams, I'm being careful. I'm making sure everything is aligning. Again, I'm reaching those areas where that inner strap panel wants to start pulling away. So I'm just keeping everything nice and secure and making sure my alignment stays as I've clipped it. So when I start to reach my strap area, I'm going to be extra careful when I hold everything, and I'm going to make sure that my strap stays nice and flat. And this is going to help make sure that all of that easing is going to take place. And that nesting is going to take place. All those extra spacing between those clips is going to not continue down, but I'm going to get caught in my stitches as I go. Alright, I should be close to a full stitch here. Let me see. Once I'm on my way back up, I can rotate. And I was pretty close. Might be a little off, but close enough for me. And I'm going to hand crank up and pivot again. And then once I get a little bit further down, we'll check and see how that point turned out. Hey, that's not too bad at all. I'll take it. Now, depending on the tension that you have your machine set to, depending on a lot of factors, you could have a potential twist in your strap. I didn't really hear any complaints about twisting on straps with my testers, and you could see all their pictures and you can tell when the straps on the Adena twist. So far so good, and I think you just gotta take it slow, make sure that you nested everything properly, make sure that your tension is perfect, and you should be good to go from that point on. Tension is one of the biggest culprits of a twisty strap because it cinches the sides. And so when you have one side cinching and another side cinching, it just causes a spiral effect. So I'm hitting this area where there's 2 layers, and even when I loosened it before, my tension isn't perfect there, so I'm going to loosen it quite a bit this time. Even if it isn't perfect tension, as long as the top side looks good and my stitches are intact and it's not super loose, I'm good to go. So if you get to this point and you are down to another stitch or 2 left before you finish and you are kind of nervous about getting into that last needle hole, then just stop 1 stitch before and pull your work from your machine, and then you can feed in that last bit of top thread into that hole perfectly. Let me see if I can show you. So there's 1 stitch left, and so this is my starting thread tail and this is my finishing thread tail. And so what I'll do is I'll just feed this through a hand needle and insert it into that hole and pull it through to the wrong side, and no one's and it looks perfect, and no one's the wiser that I didn't actually use my needle to, or my machine, to finish that last stitch. So I'll show you here so that you don't think that I am faking you out as far as my top stitching goes. So we're going to look at the exterior first, which always looks nice, right? And then it's the interior we have to worry about. So here's my strap. Nice and smooth. Let me see if I can show you again. Nice and smooth. Nice point there. And then there is the front. Let's rotate you. How about that? So we have all of our good top stitching on the exterior. And yeah, so let's look at the inside. So here's the inside. Everything's getting caught nicely. Tension is good. And the inside of my strap. So I will take this to the table and we'll look at it there. But yeah, that was a nice easy top stitch for me. It won't be for you, so please don't think you're going to have that experience your first time. So I promise with that last statement I wasn't trying to be mean, but I do want to set your expectations. I have sewn up the Adena over 20 times now. I do love the bag. I think it's so worth this kind of headache of a top stitch, of a final top stitch. And it's so much more scary if you're doing it on a flatbed. And I take all of the bad words said about it, but I absolutely adore it. It is my favorite pattern to date. I love all the wonderful angles and the points and just the overall design. It really does make me happy. It's not for everyone, and mainly because this top stitch is not for everyone. But if you can get to this point, I really hope that you love it as much as I do. So we still have some things left to do. We're very close to the end of the finish line, so let's get started on them. So like I had said at the machine, I'm going to pull my threads to the wrong side here, but I didn't finish this one. So all I'm going to do is simply insert this hand needle into that first needle hole of that first stitch that I made. Feed this thread tail through this needle, and then pull it through, and everyone thinks I had perfect stitching there. So now I'm going to knot all these threads together and secure that knot either by melting or gluing. And now I'm going to give the bag a really nice press. It's hard to see, but so I hope you can see when you press yours that the lining fits really well. Woven linings will always fit a little bit better than waterproof canvas linings, just because the nature of the ability of woven to kind of conform and be steamed and pressed a bit more than waterproof canvas does. But it should be a relatively good lining fit for you, hopefully. So after you've pressed your bag, I give you some measurements to make some marks, and that's going to be first for your pin buckle and then for the 2 rivets below that. A bigger hole for the pin buckle and smaller holes for the rivets. I'll get those punched, and then we'll mark the wrong side of the outer strap panel for the rivets to go through both layers. So with those 3 holes marked, we're going to insert the pin buckle so that the pin is pointing up towards the top of the point. We're going to feed this through that hole and feed the point back down through there. So now if you look and you see where my bar is, there is no inner strap panel. And that really helps if you have a thinner pin buckle that you're using, or thicker hardware, or I'm sorry, thicker materials. Just kind of helps keep everything a little bit more sleek. When I initially designed it, this edge went all the way up top, and it was just way too thick for a lot of my testers' pin buckles or materials, and so this was extremely a huge improvement in that part of the design, and I really appreciate my testers for bringing that to my attention. I don't use a lot of thick materials, and all my pin buckles were pretty substantial, so that wasn't an issue I was truly running into or concerned about, but again, it is something to keep in mind. So now that we have these holes, we can use them to mark the wrong side of the outer strap panel. And that is just going to let us know the depth depending on the materials we chose, if we had to trim anything down, and all that stuff. So I have one mark right here that you can't see, but I can. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. It's right there. And another mark right here. Now you see I made this mark and it's slightly off center. That's just because I was holding it off center. I don't want to punch that hole off center. So I now know how far down I need it to be, so I'm just going to make the mark right there. And I'm going to punch in the center there, but I know the depth. So now I have all of my holes punched for my pin buckle installation, so I can let that be for now. And we also need to trim down this inner strap panel here to match the outer strap panel edges. And so all of this was by design because it's so much easier to cut nice even edges when it's 2 layers versus when it's 4. So I have my block here to keep everything steady while I make my markings. And now it's time to mark for the holes for the pin buckle adjustments. So we know that we have a 1-inch wide strap, which means that we can use our 1/2-inch marking on our ruler to help make our mark centered. But because it's so important that all these marks are really centered, I don't rely only on that. I use this to help first make my marks, and then I'll go through and I'll measure across the width to make sure that I'm hitting that 1/2-inch marking perfectly there on my strap. So I just find that to be a little bit more reliable because of an angle of a ruler or just the thickness of the pen tip that I'm using and all those things. I just find that first making the markings of the depth and then going through and measuring along the width just makes everything turn out so nicely. Because if one of these holes in a sequence of holes is off center, it's going to be glaringly obvious to everyone that looks at it. At least in my opinion. I could be wrong. So from this point, we're going to measure in 2 inches and make a mark. And then we're going to measure in every 1.5 inches. I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? Is that what I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, 7. And then I'm going to make one more, and that's 8. So that's going to give us a pretty decent spacing in between, and it keeps this from being too low. It looks better when it's at 2 inches, in my opinion. You could always move things around if you want to, but this is what I like. These bottom 3 holes are pretty much decorative. If you were to put your pin buckle in this hole, the tip of the point of your strap may or may not fit into the strapper keeper, so just keep that in mind. Most of the adjustment is happening up here, which is why you have a lot of excess length for you to add more holes to if you'd like to, but essentially 5 of them are the difference in the adjustments that most people will use. Again, you can customize this length, remove length to your preference. So now for each hole, I'm going to use my ruler and just double check the center, and I'm going to make the hole just a little bit bigger so that I can see it better on my hole punch and better center it. So now we're going to punch a hole in each one of these marks. This is definitely a take your time situation. You really don't want to rush through any of this. You can't change these holes once you put them in there. So just take your time and get it correct. I use my metal block and I only hammer a couple times because that's all I need. And I use an Adena size 4 hole punch. I find this to work really well with the pin buckles from Mormino, which is where I source mine. So I like to press it down and then not puncture it, but I just like to get an impression of where the hole is going to be on my strap. Make sure it's centered over my hole correctly. And then I like to use that little impression and fit the hole punch right back in it. I've had people ask me why I don't use the hole punch option on my my standing press, and it's because I don't feel the need to, and I like how nice and clean my holes are here and I can see everything. I just feel like I have more control and it's less effort. This one I'm not using my shoulder, I'm using just the weight of the hammer, so it's less wear and tear on my body, and it only takes 2 hammers. Nice and clean. So all my hammering is finished, and if you like those results and you want to get your own set of handheld punches, I've had and used the same hole punch for 5 years now. I have not needed to replace it. It is still perfectly sharp, as you saw, and what matters is that you use the right tools for the right job. So a heavy hammer, a sharp punch, gentle hits on a metal block or an anvil that will help absorb and push, not absorb, but it'll help push that force right back up, right? It'll allow all the force to get transferred through the material versus absorbing it away like a lightweight table would. I have a little cutting mat on there, and I just highly recommend this setup. I just find it to be the best scenario for any time I'm punching a hole of this size. So I do recommend that. All of the stuff that I used, not this one was from a leatherworking shop, but very similar products and the hole punches and everything are on my Amazon storefront. I do get a small, do get paid a percentage of your sales when you buy from my Amazon storefront. It doesn't cost you anything, but it is beneficial to me, and it does help keep me going. So if you would consider that, I would greatly appreciate it. So you can see all those holes look really nice once they are absolutely centered or close to centered, or at least consistent, right? And then you see that my strap is pretty comfortable there. It's not really twisting out of anything, and it's pretty happy. So, and it fits nicely through the strapper keeper, as you can see. Not too tight. So up next is edge painting. So this thinner layer here on the shorter outer strap panel is going to be a lot easier, be a lot faster, and a lot less work on your end than this guy right here. So I'll give you some tips of how I like to orient things while I edge paint, and I'll give you the number of layers I do and how long it typically takes me. But I'm not going to walk you through the process or show you the process, because for me, it's about a 24-hour process. So that's not for everyone, and I totally get it, but I highly recommend that you edge paint because it really gives you that artisan type look that you're already getting with the rest of the Adena. So it's great to just finish the job and give it that really nice finish there. So when I edge paint my outer strap panel, I like to put my pin buckle on. 1, it means I don't have to install it after I have edge painted. And 2, it means that it helps keep it level. Now this will depend on the materials that you're using, if you followed all of the stabilization instructions and things like that, but it does help, and it is pretty simple of a technique just to kind of keep it level, because when you are edge painting something like this, you don't want it to be vertical, because if it's vertical, then it's going to drip down and you're going to have a bulge right here at the end where it's dripped and dried. Or if it's pointing down, it's going to do the same thing or potentially drip on the side of your bag or inside your bag. So I highly recommend that you keep things a bit level here for the shorter of the outer strap panels. For the longer of the two strap panels, I tend to clip it to the edge of my bag like this so that I have a level surface, and I will work on one side at a time. It's especially important for the base coat because you need so many layers and you're putting it on fairly thick, and you need a level surface to for it to dry on. I have just found that this is much easier of a process to just do one side at a time versus try and do both sides at a time. I also like to use my gooseneck light at my sewing machine, and I have some tape that is like a non-stick tape. It only sticks to itself, and I'll wrap my strap end around it and hold it there while I will paint it, and then when I'm ready to paint the other side, I can just move my light to the other side and then paint this one. So really, you can find a lot of techniques. If you have one of those things that kind of looks like an octopus and it clips a lot of edge painting projects, that would be perfect for the Adena, so you could definitely make use of that. So I will use 3 layers of base coat dents to start out with, and then I'll figure out if I need more or less from there. I will sand as needed in between layers. Typically, I'll sand a little bit in the first few layers just for helping adhesion, but then I'll really even everything out on the last one. Now, the reason why it takes me 24 hours is because I apply so many layers that I really need to make sure that they're dry in between sanding. If you sand wet edge paint, it's going to look like it. It's going to clump up, you're going to take off way more than you want to, and so it's really important that you allow it to dry fully in between each layer. The more layers you have, the longer it's going to be in between each of those layers. So your first layer you put on, I like to say, seals this edge here. It doesn't really add any depth or any additional thickness to the edge of your material. It's just sealing it. It's kind of adding like a layer of glue on it. Side note, don't add a layer of glue onto your material on the outside of your material here before you edge paint. It doesn't work. Your edge paint will peel off. That's at least for most glues. I've done it. I've tried it before. It didn't work, and so I don't recommend it. You can try it. It may work for you, and you may recommend it. To each their own. First layer to seal. The second layer helps even out. The third layer really helps even out, but it starts to build up and kind of give you that nice rounded edge from there. You may find that your cut is even enough, your material doesn't absorb a lot of your base coat, and your application was just even enough that you could be good with 3 layers. Or you may want a more rounded, more even edge, or your material absorbed a bunch of your base coat, and so you need to add another layer or 2 of that. Like I said, I start at 3, I judge what I have, and then I'll add more as needed. Once I'm happy with my base coat, and I like to say that your edge painting should mainly be your base coat. That's where you're evening out, you're smoothing out, you are applying the depth, the dimension of the edge painting, and then your color is just coloring it. You're coloring the shaping of your edge paint, if that makes sense, right? So you're trying to create a 3-dimensional edge here, and then you just want to paint over that. So you shouldn't think or attempt to add dimension with your paint, only with your base coat. Once you get done with your base coat, then I like to add 2 layers of color typically. And then if I'm feeling squirrely, I will add a top coat of like iridescent or gloss or like just a top coat, and that further gives it a little bit more longevity as far as how long it will last. This is a tool that I found really works well for edge painting. I found this back in 2023, and then it kind of took off a little bit in the sewing world once I posted about it, which is great. It truly is an amazing tool for edge painting. It's actually made for masking fluid. So if you've ever done any watercolor painting, what it does is masking fluid is like it's like a liquid glue essentially, or almost like a liquid silicone, very similar to this, but it's meant to be kind of peeled back off, and you apply it onto your paper in areas that you want to seal off so that the watercolor doesn't go, so that you leave behind the paper white instead of trying to make white with watercolor. Not always easy, right? Anyway, this is that tool. It's very cheap. It's $10 on Amazon for a pack of like 3. And what happens is you dip it in there and it kind of captures like a blob of the edge paint in this little opening here. And then as you apply it and you just rub this along, just the fact that the material grabs onto the edge paint, it pulls it away. And it continuously does that. The fibers and just the thing that you're rubbing against, just by the nature of the design, it pulls it away. And why do I like this? Well, first and foremost, it makes it a much easier cleanup. There are no grooves in here that I have to pick out with a needle like I do on the normal roller kind. I don't have to worry about ever oiling it like I do with my rollers when they get nasty, you know, kind of like gunky with time and they squeak and stuff. No, it's simply you can unscrew this and then this will widen a little bit like that, and you can adjust the flow of how much liquid comes out. So anyway, highly recommend it. There's a link in my Amazon storefront if you would like to purchase your own. So it has been a day and I have finished edge painting. Nobody's going to call it perfect. Nobody's going to call it a perfect color match, but I am happy with it, and it really gives that nice, elegant look. And so the rest of the pattern is so simple, and we're right here at the end. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to insert these rivets into the rivet holes under the pin buckle and set them. Everything should line up nicely with those holes that we punched. So remember, if you had to reinsert your pin buckle and you didn't leave it in there like me, that pin should be pointing towards the top of the bag, not towards the bottom. Then we're going to feed our strap through the pin buckle to the hole that we want. I always like mine on the shortest setting. I am a tiny human. Then give it a tug back. It's going to help keep it nice and flush where we want it. Feed this back down through. And it's always just good to take a little bit of extra care with that edge painted edge when you're inserting it that way. Then back through that strapper keeper. And even on the shortest setting, that angled edge should hit at a nice depth from the bottom. And then, of course, as you use these shorter holes, it will be raised up through that side panel like that. So now that you have essentially finished your Adena, the last thing you need to do is do what I call the squish. Now, I think it's proven to be a little confusing for some people when I say give it a squish, and I'm going to show you here exactly what I do. But the reason why I do it is because as you continue to wear your Adena, the weight of the material, the stuff that you carry in the bag, is going to already encourage the bag to be this shape. But once we get it fresh off our machine, freshly edge painted and stuff, it may not do that. Yours may still be like this, and that's not what we're going for. We're looking for this shape right here, this nice A-frame. And so with this A-frame, or how you get this sort of A-frame look, I don't even know if I'm using that term properly, but I am, is you want to squish it like this. And as you squish it, you are kind of putting this fold, this harsh fold, in these areas of the side accent panel, which is where the duck of a light is. Well, duck of a light wants to fold, wants to wrinkle, wants to crease on its own. So we're just kind of telling it where to do that. And it holds it pretty well. But it's not only just for the looks, although it really makes for a much nicer bag with that squish. It also kind of helps the magnets sit where they want to. The whole bag has been designed around this look because, again, that's how it's going to be while you're wearing it. So make sure you give it that squish. Just kind of encourage it to do what you want to. You could hang it on a doorknob with some things inside of it to kind of weigh it down and help pull it, but it's going to do this naturally anyway, unless you constantly leave it smashed and pressed and flat like that. But again, this is how it should naturally go. And before you photograph your bag, I do recommend just kind of training it a little bit. Seems like a funny thing to do. I promise all of mine have this shape and they have held up even sitting on the shelves for months. So please just trust in the process and please, please, please give your Adena a good squish. Thanks for sticking with me till the end. I hope you love your Adena. I hope that you aren't cursing me out too much right now, and I hope you learned something new along the way. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for supporting me, and happy sewing.